It's great to be here, and there's so much that could be talked about. I spent a great deal of time trying to create an outsized presentation on the SBIR program, and I've done presentations before at different groups that usually last 45 minutes and some questions, and they really kind of sort of scratch the surface, and perhaps that's the reason most of you are here today, is that I'm going to go into what I like to refer to as strategy and mechanics. All the things, the program strictures and prescriptions and rules are all out there online. I think the latest omnibus solicitation for the SBIR program is 295 pages. You do need to read probably 90% of it very carefully before you consider applying, and it will answer a lot of questions, probably raise a lot of questions, which you can contact program staff because they've conveniently got all the email addresses and phone numbers of people to pursue questions. I wanted to start with this first slide, America's Seed Fund. It sounds almost organic in a way. And there's so many great graphics online on this program. I like this one on the upper left. This is the one from the Air Force from a few years ago. They always do great stuff. $26 billion, rocket ships, big numbers, commercialization roadmap. How could you go wrong? I mean, there's a lot of blue sky type program descriptions and materials out there. And I noticed in one of the comments somebody had offered that they had been to a lot of seminars or workshops and kind of came away with exactly the same information that's repeated online. And I'm going to try to depart from that. And as Charles said, I'm hoping all of you can ask questions at any time during this presentation to raise your hand if I say anything that hits a certain recognition neuron or active neuron on a project you're working on or a question, rather than we were going to wait and do these like on an hourly basis and maybe set aside 15 minutes, but I think it's better to get your question answered in context than for me to just rattle on. So that being said, by way of introduction and interview, the qualifiers for this include the fact that my comments here today represent my experience and my opinions. They do not represent those of the National Institutes of Health or Center for Scientific Review, CSR, that I'm going to refer to quite a bit during this presentation. I'm going to do my best to stick to the syllabus you've all been given, but I'm happy to depart from it depending on what you all would like me to engage in. Just ask. And I'm happy to entertain questions and hypotheticals. What if this? What if that? I noticed in this other handout, a lot of you are currently engaged in writing in SBIR. Feel free. I'm more than happy to connect. Your questions probably are shared by others. And I notice a lot of you have written SBIRs. A lot of you are in the process of writing an SBIR. Thankfully, I wasn't sure coming into this that my experiences with the NIH divisions, and more than a few of them over the years. I'm not familiar with NSF, DOD, NASA, and the others that all have SBIR contingents, but so that's good. We're all on the same page in that regard. To repeat, at a high level, this presentation will focus on strategy and mechanics, and those words have all kinds of interesting implications, and I hope I can deliver on that. The topic areas covered in this presentation overlap a great deal. So much of what I say may seem repetitive. Please bear with me, but there's a reason that I'm repeating some of these points. If I'm really emphasizing something, write it down. Maybe it's more important than others. That being said, I touched on the outline here. Questions and answers at any time, just raise your hand and I'm happy to engage. These are the online documents you need to review. And they have not updated the instructions since 2018. I'm not sure what's holding that up, but it's almost always something. So these documents are revised, and there's all kinds of, they'll tell you in the front, there's all kinds of changes, and they'll highlight those. Pay attention to them, because some of them count. Usually they don't, but the core project directives are the same from one decade to the next, pretty much. But we'll start off with this question. It's probably on a lot of people's mind. What are your chances of getting funded? I mean, everybody knows the chances of winning at a certain kind of a gambling institution, and SBIRs have been called a legal form of gambling by a lot of small business owners. You're gambling with your time in no small way, and with a lot of other your project, something that's close to you. That, well, it turns out that over the last decade, Phase 1 SBIRs are funded right around 15%, if you took an average, something like that. So off the top, about 15%. That number needs to be qualified a little bit, because as a reviewer, and I've been reviewing for more than a few years, I would probably say about something 25 to 30% of the lower percentile of applications received are not competitive at all. They're just not in the ballpark. And so if you looked at the upper 50% of applications, you're looking at a much higher approval rate than 15%. You're probably looking at something close to 50%, 30% rather. I'm sorry, question. So
what makes an application not very competitive?
Great question that I'm going to get to in the next slides. Thank you for asking. In short, lack of experience and a poor value proposition. But I'm going to expand on those considerably. So your chances of getting funding, if you write a competitive application, you have a decent value proposition, are not too bad, actually, compared to academic grant mechanisms. Right? There's, I don't know what are R1s today, 7-8%, if that. Very much lower. Phase 2 conversion, they call it, is somewhere around 30% average. So if you get a Phase 1, finish it, go into Phase 2, your chances of getting your Phase 2 funded are somewhere in the ballpark of 30%, which is, that's not bad. That's pretty good. Basic programmatic structure, you've all heard, seen this. I wanted to touch on some of these points. Phase 1, what should a Phase 1 accomplish? Yes?
Well, what's on the fast track? What is the statistics on the fast track?
I don't know, but I'll comment and dismiss fast tracks here quick. Fast tracks, I'm going to get into this more later, but I don't know. And they have not parceled those out that I've seen. They kind of lump them together. You don't see a lot of fast tracks. You don't see a lot of STTRs for a number of reasons. And some of them have to do with the review dynamics that I'm going to touch on in the last third of this presentation. I'm going to go deep into the review process before too long here. Feasibility and proof of concept, those are very wide kinds of terms. And one person's feasibility and proof is another person's failed attempt to do that. And who decides at the end of the day that you've proven something, or you have proof of concept, or it's what you want to do is feasible? Your Phase 1 is supposed to lay some kind of a foundation. In short, reviewers decide. They decide whether you've done this. Their personal opinion of your work. In a Phase 2, this is a little strange to me when every time I read some of these compared to the experiences I've been through. I got my first SBIR in 1986. Sometimes feels like 1896. I don't know if I'm getting something mixed up, but the rules of the game has basically been the same. The dynamics are the same over a long period of time, but they keep making refinements to this. These statements like continue the R&D efforts. Well, it's kind of true in an SBIR. This language more applies, and a lot of the language in the Forms E that I showed earlier, there's different instructions for SBIRs. SBIR is the Forms E. When you go online, you can, and so they've tried to maintain the same grant structure of significance, innovation, approach, and all that. But really, you'll see some of the kind of more academically oriented concepts be a little bit out of place in the SBIR instructions. We're not really continuing R&D, we're kind of finishing a product. And there's the big distinguishing factor here. Phase 3 is commercialization. I'm not sure why they even mention this, because this is a point at which SBIR money is no longer available to you, and you're kind of on your own. You could label this good luck as another way to look at the phase 3. You're commercializing something. You're supposed to have finished all these things pretty much, with some big exceptions that I can go into. Understanding the landscape, and I wanted to emphasize in this handout some elements of strategy. You should really think through the whole story of what it is you're trying to accomplish first. And a lot of people have in their head some notion of the landscape, but you have a great idea, and you do a lot of planning, consulting, setting goals, grant creation. I use the word creation instead of writing because writing is a small part of creating a grant application at the end of the day. If you've laid out the content well and you know what you're doing, writing becomes much easier. You do a phase 1, you do a phase 2, and then what? Do you have a plan? Most people, it's difficult to kind of have a plan because you don't know what's going to happen. A lot of things can happen. I also added these for a reason, more planning. Plans change. Plans change with circumstances and events and especially unexpected things. And I also added competitive grant writing. This is important because I'll really hammer this point home today. There's a big difference between a competitive grant and one that's not competitive, and I'm going to do my best to paint some broad strokes and some fine strokes on this topic. There's no point in writing a grant if you don't have a very strong confidence in it. You can't really have that kind of a confidence level unless you really understand all the processes that go into getting funded. And I'm going to try to communicate a lot of that today. You want to write a competitive grant application, not a grant application. Big difference. Just to reiterate this point, you know, a lot of people think of VC funding, industry partnership, or bootstrap. Of these three, I'd say industry partnerships, and a lot of people think that they're developing some new technology, and some big company will want to grab it because it's fits into their general area of product development and commercialization. Don't count on it. Big companies have they have big money, but they also have very, very rigid game plans and roadmaps for what they want to develop. So I've seen a lot of small businesses run out of SBIR money and go running to going to these conferences and meeting execs at these big companies saying, hey, we've got a new medical device that does X, Y, and Z. How would you like to invest in it and partner with us? And at the end of the day, on a related topic that's, I think, important to mention here, the chances of anyone who's very successful at developing some new, let's say, electronic health device, some monitor of some kind, the chances of you marketing that yourself as your own small business are very, very low. You have to build a sales force of a lot of employees. You need a lot of resources just to get off of square one. Finishing an SBIR phase 2 may well be the entree to bigger and better things, but forming a company that does real sales and distribution as something called product indemnification happens very rarely these days. So there's people here probably from the tech transfer office that are very familiar with industry partnerships and can inform you on what options are available to you. But those are difficult to form, not impossible. VC funding, everybody's heard about this, right? It's a very common phrase and a thought that comes to mind when you want to develop some new technology. Need I comment further on VC funding? Some of my best friends are VCs, by the way. I don't, but I'm not sure that I take that too seriously. It really depends. Depends on all these things we're going to talk about. Bootstrap. What if you have, for example, a new smartphone app that connects patients to their doctors and monitors 4 or 5 symptoms 24/7? You could conceivably run that kind of a business out of your home. Right? It doesn't require a lot of infrastructure. If you've got a couple of good computer programmers and some cloud-based services from Microsoft, you can probably spin up a business like that. You're selling online, you don't need a sales force, all that. So bootstrap is a possibility as well. There's yet another possibility to develop IP that I wanted to mention, and it's something I'm engaged in now with the University of California, is where an IP holder, an institution with University of California, has a small business partner go get the SBIR money, develop all this technology that's otherwise not going to be developed because it's stalled. And the small business does the tech development, clinical validation, trial, creates additional IP, licenses it back, and the university and the inventor involved go on their merry way to market or do whatever it is that they want to do. Universities and, of course, university employees are not eligible for SBIR funding typically in full-time employment, right? You have to have 51% employment with the small business entity to be eligible. This is another alternative to pushing all this forward that I thought was worth mentioning. I've been involved in a second project now with UC on something like this. So you have to find a small business where the skill set fits what you're doing, by the way. That's a small problem.
Quick question concerning, where the university transfer office is trying to license out. In your experience, how effective has that been, the university's licensing out this feedback loop that you're showing?
I know very few universities that have tried to solicit a small business with a really good track record with SBIRs to go get money to develop something. I'm not sure. I may be the first person to have done that. I haven't. I've heard of people talk about this, but it can be really tricky for a lot of reasons. How early is early in the stage of development? How a reviewer is going to view how early this is. Is it really a viable candidate for even a phase 1 SBIR, given all the contingencies? And I'm going to go into some of those, but. It's very complicated. The university's got a lot of IP collecting dust, and they would like it to get out of that kind of a stage, but they're really kind of in a very difficult conundrum when their faculty are not eligible for SBIR funding, but the faculty is the one who actually is the inventor of it.
Right.
Stuck. Tremendous value to SBIR funding, opportunity to develop a technology or service, reduce investor risk. Looking back at this VC kind of a picture again, once you've developed something and answered a lot of the early stage questions, you've addressed, hopefully, the big risks, the big questions. And that's, again, very much in the eye of the beholder, very, very much project and context dependent. How many questions have you really answered? How well have you answered them by the end of a phase 1, phase 2? But hopefully you reduce investor risk. It puts your small business on the map. Now you're somebody. You have SBIR money, you have NIH's imprimatur on your company. It's a big deal, no question. You have no debt. You have to pay the money back. It's kind of goes without saying, sorry. And you have no stock dilution. NIH does not want to own anything in your business. That's not what they do. SBIRs versus academic grants. I noticed on this one handout, a lot of people here have done academic type grant proposals, and even though the structure is the same, again, going back to the significance, innovation approach, like, boy, these line up very closely. Well, actually not, and for several reasons. You get product development versus basic research and hypothesis testing. And the mindset for product development is worlds apart from what academics think. And I can't tell you, I'm going to share some anecdotes today, and here's the first. I met with a highly accomplished stroke rehabilitation expert, probably one of the world's thought leaders in this field. He's editor of a couple of journals and a huge program going on at a major university. And a friend connected us for lunch to talk about his project and whether it should be funded by an SBIR, pushed forward. And we had a very long meeting, and I couldn't quite grasp what it was that was new and different. And this is a highly accomplished person who's used to writing very clearly and getting right to the point over many years, and I couldn't, over a couple of hours, could not quite understand what was new and great, patentable or different or innovative about what it was he was doing. And I finally was trying to kind of break through this lack of understanding or communication here, and I said, how would this save money? What's the cost benefit of this? I thought that question might kind of, loosen things up a little bit so that I could grasp it. And he stopped, and he looked at me and he said, you're the second person who's asked me that. And it was at that point I had a feeling we weren't going to get very far with this, and we never did. And this is in the context of explaining the difference between someone who's very successful with NIH kind of grant money versus the thought process of product development, that things that seem really obvious to somebody in the SBIR world are invisible to people who are used to doing academic grants. And it doesn't seem like it should be that way, but it is. The phase 1, phase 2 structure is another big difference. You're trying to prove something in a phase 1, lay a foundation for a phase 2, versus an R21, R1, you're hypothesis testing or doing something like that. The funding levels are very different, as a lot of you know, and I've got more than a little to say about that in some slides coming up. Academically based PIs. Here's a couple of real problems. Even people in academia who want to make a transition to a small business, let's say they are willing to cast their fate to the wind and leave academia at least 51% time so that they can submit an SBIR and run a small business, is a real problem for reviewers. And I'll talk about this more. They just don't have the experience running a small business. Yeah, but they're pretty smart and all that. Well, reviewers have their own thoughts about that. And this will come up again. Technology development expertise. How many computer programmers did you say you have available on your staff? Questions like this that are not a small deal. Deciding whether to apply. First and foremost, coming back to this value proposition. What is the strength of your value proposition? How do you know? I mean, I've talked to a stroke expert about this who was not aware at all of what the real world value proposition was of this program that he developed. Who can you ask? Well, the tech transfer people here, a very good idea. A lot of them are, I'm sure, former VCs or affiliated with VC type companies, and they're very used to evaluating concepts and trying to put numbers to concepts, which is very, very difficult. You see people struggle with this. As a reviewer, I see people struggle with this routinely. How do you put numbers to a good idea? Market research, well, market research, if you're doing something truly new, there is no market research for it by definition. That's very difficult. Vetting your product concept. And again, if you're a startup, you've got all these kinds of things to think about. And I'm going to touch on this more, but I thought it was worth mentioning here. Resources to implement, coming back to this question of what you have available to implement a project. Probability of success, something to think about. Earlier I mentioned the probability of getting phase 1, phase 2 funding. If you're going to take this leap into this adventure, and it's a great deal of time, and it's more than your time, but it's a lot of your time to do that. You can weigh your probability of success by talking to people who have done this before and give you probably a very good read on that most of the time. What about first-time PI and new small business? Here we're getting into an interesting topic area. I'm not sure, I rewrote this several times, and I came back to this statement. A new PI is at a serious competitive disadvantage in review. And you hear reviewers say over and over, I hear them say over and over, isn't this great? So you have 5 scoring axes in a proposal. I'm going to go through those before this is over in greater detail. But you hear reviewers say, and this PI has successfully implemented SBIRs before. So you get that contributes to a very good score for the investigator's axis of scoring. What if you don't have any experience doing this and you've never done any small business grant, have no facilities available, but you're at a disadvantage for more reasons than that. If you have a new small business, by definition, you may not have an office, may not have any employees. You're proposing to develop a lot of software, electronics. As a new small business, you don't have those things unless you're really, really active and have a lot of LinkedIn connections or something, people willing to contribute their CV and have them be cited as key personnel in your proposal. This is a real conundrum. There's no easy answers to this. There's people who do get around this, but and I'll talk about it more. Key personnel, yes.
So before you said a key factors have implemented SBIR grants before, but would like a PI that's been managing a lab for X amount of years, who have gotten multi-million-dollar grants, who have executed other things, or is it really just that business management?
You're painting a very good kind of in-between case here of someone who's been highly funded by NIH. Reviewers look on that with kind eyes. Nonetheless, not having any technology development experience per se, someone stumbles across, and I'll share a couple of anecdotes on this. They come across something that somebody at their university or somewhere else spots as a solution to some healthcare issue of some kind. And now what do? You're taking off in a different direction than just hypothesis testing or basic academic kind of research. And reviewers, again, coming back to this final common pathway for projects, it's a big deal to have your university credentials and previous NIH funding. But there's really, it depends on how good of a score you want in that checkbox for investigators. But, and some of these slides are going to bring this out further, but to jump ahead a little bit, you're competing. This is a competitive process, so you're competing against people who are deeply experienced, who know very well how to play the game. And I hesitate to use that phrase, but I'm off the top of my head right now, I can't think of a better way to put it. Is that a question?
Yeah, what in the case where you've had a SBIR grant before, but in a different area?
Well, it still works in your favor in terms of that
You should
score.
mention that, even though,
Oh, absolutely.
even though there's a checkbox saying, have you gotten one in substantially the same area? And you say no, because I haven't. But I have gotten SBIR.
Well, is everyone in this room familiar with the word biosketch? No one unfamiliar with that? Biosketch is your kind of a CV in
That's where you put that.
in NIH speak. And I didn't bring a copy of I probably could bring up my biosketch today, but I've done a lot of different things, too many different things over the years. But you want to have a biosketch that highlights your relevance to a particular project in some way, shape, or form. And I've seen a lot of very nuanced biosketches over the years where people are putting the best possible foot forward when it's very difficult to do so, but they're very careful to prominently refer to their previous successes. And this is always cited as a plus. 99% plus of the time, reviewers in session will say, and this person has successfully implemented SBIRs before. So that's, it's a big deal to include that. It deflects criticism or avoids leaving a gap in the minds of reviewers.
I'm curious because you have small business on one side and first time, PI on the other side. And we have a lot of small business experience, serial entrepreneurship, so on and so forth. And we have nothing on the SBIR side. And we have received a grant, but not SBIR. And when we were talking with one of the NIH institutes, they said without a clinical partner or something, forget it. I mean, it was just a flat, like, go find yourselves a clinical partner, somebody who's done this before. So I'm kind of curious if that's, if what we're really saying is that if you're a small business, even if you're successful on that side, and it's supposed to be small business, it really is, because it's NIH, that's going to be, a major influencer, is what it sounds like.
Well, to be specific, I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to, but in the case of where a small business is developing some healthcare technology that needs to be validated in a patient sample, is this kind of where you're going with that?
Eventually, if we went from phase 1 to phase 2, yes.
Well, even in a phase 1, and I'm going to get to that too, and some real serious mechanics on how you partition a phase 1 and 2, because it's a real. Every situation is so different, but yes, you will need a clinical partner. If you're doing patient testing, you need access to a patient population. There's no substitute for that, and you do need to go find somebody, including people at this university. I mean, this is a large university. You have all kinds of active researchers, and you subcontract to them within the SBIR.
You should look for, when you're looking for that partner, then we should then be the ones that are preferencing somebody who has SBIR experience, if that's.
If you're going to subcontract to them, they don't need SBIR experience unless they're writing the proposal. But if you're writing the proposal, it's, no, they come in as key personnel and in facilities and resources statement.
Might this differ too between different institutes? Like I've heard, we got ours first one from NSF and then reapplied to NIH. But I've heard NSF can be slightly easier or better to start than others. I'm just curious if you've heard anything from different institutes being slightly different standards.
That's very tough to say. If you have a clear kind of a healthcare technology play, you're really talking NIH, one of the divisions there. And if you're talking like, for example, early sensor development that kind of points in some healthcare direction, kind of sort of, but that's very tricky. That's a very tricky kind of a tweener situation of whether, NSF will entertain all kinds of things, but still, even with NSF, there has to be some value proposition, some specific market you're targeting, and it has to be clear even in a phase 1, and I'm going to touch on that as well.
Right, and then more like previous SBIR checking that box of having that.
Yeah, and let me be clear. I may have started an incorrect mem here, but you don't really check a box. It goes into your biosketch.
Right.
So when reviewers are looking at your biosketch, they will absolutely notice the presence or absence of that. Is there another question here or something?
Yeah, and just a generic question. So I'm a key personnel. So say you have a PI who doesn't want to leave their academic position, but there is a full-time project manager that wants to run with the project and start a small business. And they do have access to the facilities. But so would that sort of inexperienced project manager be at a disadvantage being the PI on the SBIR, given that your best shot is with the actual PI?
In a word, yes.
So should the big PI be like a key advisor or something?
Yep.
As part of this?
They have to, but they'll also, this is a very common situation, a very common dilemma of where some inventor, some lead in some new thing is not about to leave a paying job to go adventure with the NIH SBIR program. That's just not going to happen for a lot of reasons. So then you end up with a substitute PI. And reviewers have a mind of their own about these kinds of things. That whoever that other person is who's PN, you can also be co-PIs. And you could entertain an STTR kind of a mechanism. I don't recommend it to anyone in this room. A lot of you may know the STTR pot of money is an extremely small percentage of any division's SBIR budget. That's why you rarely see one of these things make it to review. It's just, it's very complicated. They're a lot more work, and it's better to find a way to go around that just because the probabilities of getting funding that you really need are so much lower.
So my PI is a private practice psychologist who has previous NIH experience, but relatively remote, like in the 90s, 80s, and 90s. So as we have a new company for this, but would it be better to use the much older private practice corporation? Does that count for anything?
If you wanted me to give a really clear answer, I'd have to see it on paper.
Okay.
But from the sound of what you're saying, I would tend to agree with the idea. But it's funny how ideas that sound good in conversation, or if you're playing back and forth in your head, look a lot different when you put them on paper, right? So I'm going to move along with this. Facilities and resources, I've mentioned before, it's a real problem for a new business. And this is optional. This is recommended in the application guidelines, the facilities and resources statement, a separate section. And you have as much space as you want. There's no page limitation on it. You give all the facilities and resources. And in the case where you're subcontracting out to a university or clinic to do some patient testing, you mention them in that facilities and resources statement as well. It's more than just window dressing or appearances. It's a serious kind of affiliation that benefits the application. And what are your own facilities? Do you have facilities available to implement a project like this? See what I'm getting at with this kind of the new PI to new small business. There's a lot of issues here. Aiming your application, very important. Which division should you apply to? Usually this is pretty clear. But I've seen a lot of in-between cases where this could straddle mental health and aging. It could straddle neurology and mental health. But you should give it some thought. And talk to the program people, the people at NIH, program director. Feel free to email them. Sure.
Well, I've sent 2 emails and a phone call to a program director over a period of almost 4 weeks, and never got a response.
I'm not surprised. These are incredibly busy people who are being chased by very aggressive, very skilled grant applicants. If you go to any of these big things like Society for Neuroscience, you see some of these program directors being darn near mobbed. Looks kind of like a rock star kind of a thing. It's kind of strange to me, but they're people who control a great deal of money, and they're getting their attention can be difficult.
Just take persistence?
Persistence should pay off with this, and a lot of times these people are so busy, and program directors that I've known for 20 years plus still are quick with me on the phone, if I can get them on the phone, when I can get them on the phone, and they usually say, send me a 1-page outline bullet points, no more than 1 page. I'll be looking for it in my email. Goodbye. And that's pretty much what you'll get. And I'm going to touch on this in another context again. But it's very frustrating when you need guidance on this and you're not getting an answer. If you're not getting an answer from a program director, look at some of the other staffers that are broken down in some of the subdivisions in the solicitation on this that you might contact. They're a lot more accessible and may be able to answer your question. If they can't, them forwarding it to the program director is probably a lot more effective than you trying to contact them.
I found it very frustrating. And I did send a 1-pager.
And it was still ignored.
Yeah.
Put my name on it next time and see if that doesn't help. Let me know who you're trying to get in touch with. But it's very difficult. These people are being chased a lot. I get some funny stories if we get time on this. But
Were we on the deadline for it, or was it?
No, it was like 2 months ahead of time.
that's disheartening. It's, but you can also get help from people who have experience with these program directors, and maybe even your institution, to have somebody send an email that looks like it has a little more gravitas to it, if you follow me. Program priorities and relevance, very big deal. So you need to read through the program topics of interest. They used to call them topics of interest, now they're called special interest or something. They keep changing the phrase around. I'm not sure why. Somebody keeps playing with this, but you need to know which areas of which agency your proposal fits into for a whole bunch of reasons. One of them is when it comes time for a program director to separate your application from one that has an identical score, and I'm going to touch on this in the last part of this presentation, which one are they likely to favor? Well, the one that aligns most closely with their stated topics of interest. And it also, this also overlaps with another issue I'm going to get to. Again, check the topics document for topics of interest and see where your project aligns. Cite that alignment in your application. Do not make the mistake. It's a big mistake to let that go. A lot of times reviewers can look at something that seems a little bit off topic to them, and it helps to remind the reviewers that this application addresses this topic area mentioned in the solicitation, and if you have some programmatic number or label, use it. I would mention that in the abstract, I'd mention it in specific aims, and I'd mention it in the significance section as well, so that it's very clear. That's a very powerful thing, and it makes it easy for the program director to spot it, although they're usually pretty good at spotting that anyway. Make it easy. Which mechanism? Regular phase 1, phase 2, fast track, direct to phase 2, STTR. These are all possibilities. And which one you pick is depends on your project. I've seen more in the last year for some reason. I've seen more direct to phase 2s than I have for a while. Direct to phase 2 is when you have a project that basically is past the point of initial proof of concept. Clearly past that point. Clear in whose mind? In reviewers' minds. You have to kind of think like a reviewer. How much proof of concept do you have? Again, one person's proof of concept is another person's kind of unclear, ambiguous idea of proof. Fast tracks, I just wanted to comment on this because fast tracks are a real attractive prospect, because in a fast track you combine a phase 1 and a phase 2 and your commercialization section. It's everything in one fell swoop. And it sounds great, but fast tracks are very difficult to write. They're very difficult to review. They rarely score well, and I can go into the mechanics of that if any of you like, but one of the core idea of a fast track is that you are not pausing at the end of a phase 1 and get a separate additional committee review as in the normal phase 1, phase 2. You're asking program staff at NIH to waive that so that you can go directly into a phase 2 based on a progress report you submit to them. And they would sit down and look at your progress report and say, or something else. Maybe not in agreement, but you're asking them to waive that separate review, and they will make the decision about whether to release phase 2 funds or not. The advantage of fast track is saving time for something, and if you have a really, really high value proposition idea and you have all the people in place and all this, I just reviewed a fast track a few months ago. It was one of the best written proposals I've ever seen, and the PI, it was actually a revision of a fast track, and this guy did an incredible job on it. Everything was done so well, and you're wondering what happened to it. Well, what happened was I scored it as a 3, and I was ready to move to a 2, which is accepted. The pay lines are around 3. We'll talk about that, but I was ready to move to a 2, depending on what the other 2 reviewers had to say. It turns out the other 2 reviewers scored it horribly and pulled it right out of discussion, and I couldn't believe it. I read their comments before the session and found little substance in them. It was a strange thing. They asked the same questions they asked that the guy had already answered in the introduction and throughout the application. And this happens. This is very frustrating. What happens when you can't get through to reviewers and they're just not listening to what's being said? And I could write a book about that.
Quick question about fast track. Back in the late 90s, when I was active in this and successful, but not with the fast track, with phase 1, phase 2. But on the fast track back then, if you, the reviewers thought, well, this is great, we think this will give you a phase 1 award, but not give you the fast track. It's sort of the phase 1 baby booby prize. My understanding is now, it's the fast track is a go, no-go. You either get it or you don't.
No, there's an interim review by NIH staff. So you do the phase 1, stop, send in a progress report, and several people at your division who are involved and responsible for managing your project, managing the award, look at that progress report, and they decide yes or no.
No, I'm not being clear, I'm sorry. The idea is that the fast track, where they review it, and they say, okay, fine, you get the fast track, or no, you don't. Is that the way it works now? Because it used to be, you apply for a fast track, and the reviewers said, fine, this is really not acceptable for phase 2, we'll give you phase 1.
I haven't heard of that happening. Usually they would kick you back to another mechanism. They wouldn't, at least.
It happens in contracts. Because the contracting, they said, the contract that was due in October, they said, this is the one rare point where we might evaluate and give you a 1 and tell you we refuse you on the 2 and fast track. Otherwise, no.
Yeah, contracts are a different kind of, you can break those into pieces easier than you can these.
But more recently, something's not articulated well in a commercialization plan in a phase 2, well, you just sunk your phase 1 opportunity.
Right.
That's
Pretty much.
I don't know how long it's been in place, but
Yeah.
Pretty much, yes.
I just have a question. So phase 1, phase 2, fast track, direct to phase 2. Is this one big pot of money?
Yep.
Okay, so it is purely on the merit. It's not like we're gonna give this much to phase 1s, we're gonna give this much to direct to phase 2s. It's one big pot of money, and it's just the cream rises to the top with the combination of those.
Pretty much, with the provision, again, that the program director does have discretion in making awards that most closely align with their topics of interest. And so that's I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later, because it's, after you submit a proposal that you know comes in close, you're kind of holding your breath for a few weeks, waiting to see what's going to happen. Question?
Based on your last story, is there an appeals process?
Oh, if only. No, this is not like the legal system works, although in years gone by, people would challenge what they called a flawed review. And I'll share a quick story with you. It's a project in which someone had developed a new kind of robotic assist device for people, and very complex project, and they got a terrible review, and the applicant bitterly complained to the scientific review officer at CSR, justice was not served here, and I'm very upset. To which this guy would not go away. I talked to this one person at CSR who's I would say a friend, but an acquaintance at a minimum. And so he said, these guys don't understand. You need to bring an expert in this field in. They'll give me a fair review. So they brought in an expert in this field, because SBIR, CSR review committees are limited. They may not have anybody in your specific area, as hard as they try, and CSR works remarkably hard at bringing in reviewers, and they have a sheet you fill out on your skill areas of experience and all this, and they try to match applications. As much as they try to do that, somebody would come in with a proposal from a direction, it's just very difficult. So what happened in this one review, they brought in a real hotshot expert reviewer. And this particular project was a high priority for the agency involved, the division involved. And we saw a couple of the program people in the old days, they'd walk into the room because they wanted to sit down and listen to exactly what happened to something that they thought was a very high topic of interest, relevance. Some people would say, I wouldn't say, PR value for the agency or NIH, very visible project. So they brought in this other reviewer who was really an authority in this field of, let's say, robotics. And as soon as he got the green light to turn on his microphone, the first sentence out of his mouth was, "This project has at least 3 fatal flaws." Oops. So it kind of can backfire to have somebody in your field that can make finer distinctions between good and bad, right or wrong, than it does to have the reviewers there who make these gestalts of your application. Phase 2B. Anybody ever heard of this? Phase 2B? A couple people? Phase 2B is where you can get a lot of money after you finish a Phase 2. And if you read the advisories, the guidance on this that NIH puts out, it's a little confusing. Is everybody eligible to apply for Phase 2B? Bridge funding, they call it, for projects that have outstanding kind of potential. Need I say, projects with very high program relevance that meet their key topics of interest very, very closely, that the program director really wants to see go forward, versus any other SBIR project that would like to get additional funding because they ran out of money in a Phase 2. So Phase 2Bs, I'm going to leave it to all of you just to mention as a possibility. This came up, some people say, when SBIR program directors started funding a lot of early stage drug development. And this goes back more than a few years. And there's never enough time or money for early stage drug development, right? It's incredibly risky. There's never enough money. I mean, even how many hundreds of millions of dollars go into, real RCTs and all that for drugs. So this came up, though, for projects that really, really, really needed that money. But that has to be really, really, really clear to that program director. You're asking for this special favor, might I say, that they take your project that seriously. And they'll tell you. Usually, program directors typically are deferential in phone calls. And I've seen people corner some of them at some of these conferences before and ask about something. And they're usually very polite and smile and say, "That sounds interesting." And they'll usually tell you no, though, in some polite way, if some project you've got that you want to be reviewed or funded by their agency is not relevant, not in their wheelhouse, so to speak. Check out Phase 2Bs if you've got a really hot project and or drug candidate, PET ligand, something like that. How to create an SBIR. Well, we could be here a long time with this, but I'm going to try to make it go fast. Plan the whole project first, not just the grant. This is back to the landscape issue. You need to have a clear vision of where this is all going. Where would you like it to go? Know everything in your topic area. Whenever I take on a project, and it seems like I'm always doing something completely different from one year to the next, that I'm involved in a project right now, and I might share a couple of anecdotes to develop a new system for risk identification for premature infants for cerebral palsy. And I've never published in that field or anything. It took me quite a while to come up to speed in this topic area. It's a very, very, very complicated project with a lot of electronics, 3D camera vision, machine learning stuff. And so if you take on a new project, and most people don't do what I do, they work in the same area they've been working in for 10 years, and they already know the topic area. They know the references that are all relevant off the top of their head. But know everything in your topic area. Content creation. You have to create content for a proposal. When I create a proposal, I start writing all kinds of things that are within the scope of the application, the 5 main divisions, and then I start integrating. And when I approach a proposal, I write everything that I think that comes off the top of my head for a couple of months, 3 months, 4 months. I just write it all. Every bullet point, every thought I have, I write it out, and then I squeeze it down. I know people who go the exact opposite direction. They have much clearer minds than I do. But I find the projects I'm working on, like the cerebral palsy thing, they got so many moving parts that no one person could easily integrate all those things and make it happen. Justify and deliver on every assertion. You start making assertions in the abstract and summary statement. You're already making promises. You're saying, we're going to do this. This is great because of this reason. You have to deliver on every one of those assertions you make, including specific aims. Needless to say, but this is worth mentioning because there's a lot of complex ways to do that. It's not so easy, especially when the assertions are ambiguous, they're a little hazy. What about preliminary studies and data? Well, depending on what you're proposing, you got a real, I asked somebody, since I'm looking around at the audience here today, I can use the phrase catch-22. I mentioned this to an assistant of mine who said, what's a catch-22? I said, I realized that I was getting up in years or something. Or maybe there's some kind of invisible barrier between the generations or something. But you can't, it's a real difficult problem. What if you have a really great idea, but you have no preliminary data? You're going to ask, here's what's going to happen in review. You're going to ask reviewers to take a flyer on your assertions of how likely you are to be able to implement phase 1. So the questions you're asking in phase 1 have to sound pretty answerable within that context. There's real art here, and there's no substitute for an experienced grant writer at this point. If you're in this kind of a situation, very, very tricky. This is, and with reviewers, it's seat of the pants. Can they pull it off? Can they not pull it off? How big of a question yet? How many patients? You not want any patients? Every situation's different, but there really is no substitute for preliminary data. I'm working on a project right now. I'm going to hold off till I get to one of the other slides, but I'm dying to tell you a story that illustrates a lot of these points. Cover all the bases. We haven't done that. Use available space to specified limits in the application. Do I need to say that? I've seen a lot of proposals that don't do that. It's usually a flag immediately that somebody has no idea what they're doing. Don't waste one line. Don't waste one phrase in an SBIR. You got 6 pages for the main body of the application, plus the abstract and summary and specific aims. You need to use every line, every bit of space to communicate everything you want as clearly as possible. Are reviewers necessarily going to read everything you've written carefully? A diligent reviewer, yes, absolutely. Does that leave room for non-diligent reviewers to ignore a lot of what you've written? Yes, it does. I'll get to that with all due respect to my fellow reviewers and colleagues at CSR. And more. Often, there are people who wish to press the limits a little bit. And in the application guidelines, you'll see the 15 characters per inch, no more than 5 lines per inch vertically. A lot of people will push those. You're not supposed to use smaller than a 12-point font or something. Well, especially when you have something, you write a revised application, and the first page is the introduction to the revised application. And you have 1 page to say everything and anything you want in response to all those criticisms. That's not a lot of room. You can bet it's the first thing that the reviewers are going to read. Do they answer my questions? Do they resolve these or not? And I've often been in the situation where I wished I had 2 pages to respond to that, but you only get 1. So be sure to use space very carefully. Specific aims, yes.
Concerning spacing, what about graphs and charts? Because the wording is it's still readable. What does that mean?
Great question. Glad you asked it. Graphs and charts can sell a project. Like in business, pictures worth 1,000 words kind of a thing, but the problem is the space they take up. And savvy applicants today will tend to make these graphics, charts things a lot smaller with the understanding that when that thing is PDF'd, and it will be by the agency before it's sent to reviewers, the reviewers, if they're having a little trouble seeing something, can just hit that scroll button, or they can click on the plus sign and make that thing larger, rather than making it larger on the page, because space is so, I mean, you run out of 6 pages fast. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've written 12 pages and had to cut and hack half of it to get it to fit the page limit, and everybody's in the same boat. So, but it's a powerful thing. It depends on how much of the story it tells or sells, to whether you use graphics or charts in a proposal. Sometimes it's a must, and you're just going to have to live with the impact on your space limit text.
Sure, but in terms of the chart or graph itself, you're saying you can make use of the fact that the PDFs, you can blow up a chart. But even so, it depends on how they're scanning it into the system again.
No, they're pretty good at that. Yeah, they're pretty good at that. That's, yeah.
So when making your grant competitive, do grants, or I'm sorry, applications get bounced because they don't meet like technical or procedural requirements of the?
Yes.
Okay.
Had it happen to me. I tried to squeeze a font down one time, and I got the application kicked back to me in 10 days. That was many years ago, though.
Oh, so they'll actually like review that first before even looking at the substance content of it.
Well, they tell you no more than 15 characters per inch. Whatever you do, it better not be more than 15 characters per inch according to the way we count them, and it better not be more than 5 lines per vertical inch. And however, some savvy, agile applicants might say, if you were to ask them, that they would play with those font limits to their own advantage. I mean, you're trying to win at the game, right? And no one knows the magic formula at which somebody at CSR will say, you stepped over the line and kick this back and go fix it and come back 4 months later at the next deadline. Nobody likes to do that. A 4-month delay is, for some projects, is life or death for a lot of reasons that are complex. Right? But people do take chances when they're up against a wall and there's so much they want to say. Understand the review process, and I'm going to spend the last 25–30% of this presentation on the review process because really it's important. You'll understand when we get to this section. Is writing style important? I once heard an NIH representative say, we don't care about style. Well, reviewers do. And no matter what anybody at NIH says, at NIH, and that's true. The directors of a program don't care about the writing style, but they do have to pay attention to the score came from reviewers. They do care about the writing style because it's a flag. A poor writing style something is an immediate flag. And for those of you who have never written a grant application, you do need mentoring in that area because the look and feel of an NIH grant application is a unique thing. And reviewers are used to seeing a certain kind of look and feel to a grant application, and things that come in from right field, you've just given them something else to think about. Is kind of the lesson here. Application structure. Well, these are all the things that are available in the handout, and I just wanted to mention these. You can spend your own time in this, but I put a little star next to 2 of these because these are score drivers. Innovation is a really tough one, and I can't tell you the number of times I've had even my applications. I've had an application in where a major university did some preliminary work that showed about 5% of what it needed to show for a project to go forward. I did a partnership thing with them in which I'm going to create 95% of all the hardware, software, intellectual property, database. And I think the lead reviewer said, well, the innovation embodied here is only incremental. We're doing 95% and that's an increment? It's kind of the other way around, isn't it? Well, this is a phrase I've seen so many times, and it's an easy critique. It's an easy attack because it's also a problem if there's 5 or 6 products in a market that are already on there and you don't acknowledge them. How innovative is your project? I'm reviewing something right now that has this exact problem, and it's very much in the eye of the beholders, the innovation score. But it's a big score driver. It's an easy thing to attack because it is subjective. And a lot of reviewers, unfortunately, for academic grants and SBIRs, view it as their mission to attack something rather than to praise it for the good things in it. And it's not true of all reviewers, but a lot of reviewers are out for criticisms rather than being more kind of balanced in their comments and viewpoint. So these are all the other things, references, protection of human subjects. These sections are also fear of protection of human subjects sections. And you better cover everything in the latest guidance on this, because some reviewers are absolutely fully engaged on everything you put into the protection of human subjects. Facilities and resources we touched on. Budget justification. One quick comment about budget justification. Budgets are not part of the scoring process and in review. You may have an outsized budget. We're going to talk about those in a minute, but you can have an outsized, huge budget and it will not affect your score. At least it's not supposed to. It can raise questions in reviewers' minds. I saw phase 2 come in the other year, it was over $3 million. And that raised a flag in my mind when I saw this number of what's going on around here. And this proposal was it was not the only thing that seemed out of balance to me about this particular proposal. But
I guess a question on the innovation section. A lot of times when I get to that, it ends up feeling very redundant. It just seems like I built the case for some of those points earlier, how it's a novel problem or novel solution to a problem. Then when I get to innovation, it always feels like either redundant to what I've said before, or just kind of a shorter section, and I'm not sure how to pace things to lead to that section well.
you need an expert grant writer to comment on that. This is where it's not just a second pair of eyes, but somebody who's done this a lot, that really is, I know exactly what you're saying. I understand, and I'm sympathetic. Don't call me at 2 in the morning if you're up late on a Saturday or something working on a grant application. But there is overlap, and overlap implies redundancy is just what I was going through, the page limits, the space limits. Redundancy is kind of to be avoided, except in the case that you're really trying to make sure reviewers don't miss key points. And this innovation thing, that's real art to writing the innovation section. I rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. I spend incredible amounts of time on my applications, and some of you probably saw that embarrassing announcement about this presentation today is about my approval percentage and things, and it comes at a price. You're either going to spend the time or I was just in a big meeting with some people at UCI, and some young kids were considering some project, and I guess it was my dark side coming out or something like that. And I said, how much do you like going out on Saturday nights and having fun and engaging with your friends? And I said, those days may be over for a while if you really want to take this seriously. And I had this one, some Russian lady was in the room, and she goes, why do you keep talking about this Saturday night stuff, Jim? And a big program director was there, and he goes, because those references aren't there on a Tuesday, that's why. And it was, I said, it's just, I'm euphemistically referring to the amount of effort, the threshold for effort to make those things right. And it's an incredible amount of writing and rewriting. And I know some of the most successful grant writers in the program's history over the years, and I think all of them would say pretty much the same thing. You're always questioning yourself, and I've never submitted a grant proposal I don't think that I felt really happy about as many times as I've been doing it over this many years. It's a matter of work, questioning yourself. Yeah. What can get you into trouble? Yes, there's more to this than what I've already shared with you. Coming back to this value proposition thing again, I can't say it enough, and you've got to have somebody vet those values, vet that cost-benefit thing, somebody who's an expert. Who besides you thinks it's a great idea? And we're going to touch on this in a couple of slides coming up. Lack of preliminary data studies, huge problem. Again, a catch-22, chicken and egg problem, overstated claims of significance. Saw a proposal, so many proposals that stand out as a real flag to me when the claims of significance for something are way out of line with the narrative of the application. And some applicants have gone to stating their big points in all capitals, bold, which is kind of rude in a way. It's kind of shouting at the reader, isn't it? I found it to be kind of annoying, and had a kind of a problem with that. It's your, except that, you know, if you've been beat up enough time in reviews, you might say, hey, please pay attention to this and not stop ignoring my key points here. Separation from competing products and services. I've got a great slide coming up that's going to touch on this, but unclear, undisciplined approach section, not citing weaknesses and contingencies for addressing. This is all kind of common sense, isn't it? These are, I think, the primary things to be concerned about. You need to separate yourself from the competing products and services. It has to be very clear. Coming back to this innovation thing, how innovative is this? Is it only incremental innovation? That's a great, I've seen this term used so many times. It's a kind of a cop-out, I think, actually. Too little or too much in phase 1 goals. How much to put into a phase 1? Well, it's got to be reasonable, it's got to be doable. Yeah, but you want to impress reviewers too, right? One of the best grant writers and most successful grant writers I've known in the history of the program had one rule. He said, I always overpromise in phase 1s. And he's pretty much right. With the provision that you can back up what it is you say you're going to do. But he would overpromise rather than underpromise. And to share another anecdote at this point, I get into a real disagreement with another reviewer over a project that had some very, very experienced applicants. And these applicants had come in with a modest budget, and their goal in the phase 1 had a new patient interactive kind of assistance program for a certain disease condition. And the patient would interact with the computer, and it would be save money and time and all that. And so the phase 1 goals were to look at the acceptability and usability of the graphical user interface for this impaired population that they were looking at. I found that to be, in this particular case, from this particular applicant, which you're not supposed to factor, but I found that to be insufficient for me. It was not really substantive to me. This is a very tough question. It's worth spending a few minutes on. How much is a usability and acceptability study? Yeah, but you haven't shown anything about whether it works. Yeah, but it's only phase 1. Yeah, but you haven't said anything about whether it works, because it's back and forth. So I got into a serious back and forth, and I'd actually talked to the CSR, SRO, the scientific review officer, 2 weeks before this review, and said, I'm going to come down here on this proposal, and I wanted you to know my reasons, because I'm going to be insistent on it, and I'm anticipating some pushback. And that's exactly what happened in the session. And the SRO sided with the other reviewer, and I said, this was the one we talked about 2 weeks ago. But how much is enough in a phase 1? If you're a reviewer and someone only looks at the acceptability and usability of the interface, well, that's important. It is a prelude to looking at some kind of validity. Here's a fine point. Here's something worth writing down. If you're in this kind of a situation, you can't do everything in a phase 1. And we're going to see in a minute what the real limits of a phase 1 budget are. It'll brace yourselves. But to me, you really have to show something substantive. And sometimes for a PDA type device, a smartphone-based thing, usability and acceptability, where there's not some big question, the big question, the 800-pound question in the closet of hanging completely loose until a phase 2. Because then your phase 2 is at huge risk for failure of that. Because, well, that's just the way the program is. Well, different reviewers and people give you very different takes on this, and it all comes down again to this context dependence of a particular application. But my advice to you is to reach for that. Even if you have, how many here are familiar with the concept of statistical power for powering a clinical study? You understand powering a study? You have to have a certain number of subjects to meet power requirements given a few assumptions. Well, even in a phase 1, if you would test 10 people on some question, a central question of validity or validation of what it is you're doing, if you can do that and just acknowledge, see, this does not meet statistical power requirements, but nonetheless it provides a valuable window to in establishing a foundation for phase 2, even though it doesn't meet power requirements. And I've seen this done very, very skillfully. And that's a much better proposition than taking too small of a bite out of that. We're going to see in a second how big of a bite you can take this.
How does it look though when you're applying for the phase 2 if you overpromised in your phase 1 application? Does that ding your chances at all in the phase 2, or as long as you got the proper approvals to change any specific aims or?
No, I don't think so at all. I think it's all going to depend on that progress report that's going to be part of the phase 2. If you met the goals, you met the goals.
So you're saying during the phase 1 application, if you kind of overpromise what your goals are, and really ambitious about those specific aims or goals, knowing you may not meet them, as long as you update them with your program officer along the way, are you good in not getting dinged in that progress report for your phase 2, or does it look better to make sure you meet all those goals from your initial application?
Great question, to which there's not a simple answer. You're raising several contingencies, but and you are free. I think most of you understand in a grant, the principal investigator is free to make all kinds of changes in the scope and direction of a project with the provision that you send the program director a letter just to let them know. And you're not free to start on a Alzheimer's test and convert it to a cancer drug development project. That's a little bit out of bounds, but outside of that, you are free to change that. And you just stated that you be clear and honest in the progress report of the results you got. But there's real art in what you're saying and how much risk taking, how much you're exposing yourself to failure. And this really comes down to those, dare I say again, those Saturday nights of really hitting these project areas hard and really looking at everything in the literature. This is where this extensive knowledge of published literature comes into play to justify those steps of what certain people did. I'm in a project right now, I'm looking at a prospective project where I'm going back 20 years in this one field and looking at all these papers, and people would say, well, Jim, you're so obsessive about this. I mean, you take it easy. Not really. When you're going to write about this and you want justification for something to sharpen your own thought process up to the present point, and be able to, so, yeah. Don't ever do this. I can tell you based on great experience, don't rush to meet a deadline. A bad idea. It'll almost always cost you. Just wait the 4 months. Sometimes you can't wait the 4 months. The company's life is on the line. You've got employees who are going to leave if, I've been in these situations, but my advice to you is wait till the next deadline if you're not sure. Not understanding your audience. Your target audience are reviewers. And so you can bounce a lot of ideas off me here today as somebody who's done more reviews than I can count. Flags, again, I mentioned before, poor writing style, small number of references, unclear cost benefit, kind of goes without saying. These are things that are all flags for reviewers. An omission in the phase 1 instructions. Any guess? Anybody who's written an SBIR, can you think of a glaring omission? Something you're expected to do, but that is mentioned virtually nowhere. I'm not seeing any hands. All right. Commercial relevance and direction. Well, what am I talking about here? That's not mentioned. That's not a section in the phase 1. No, it's not. But reviewers fully expect you to paint the picture of the cost benefit. Where is this going commercially? What's the value of it? Yeah, but there's no section for it. Yeah, but you're supposed to do it. Where do you put it then? Wherever it fits. A really experienced grant writer who's been through this many times, I would mention it in the abstract. I'd cover it in the specific aims, and absolutely in significance. Mostly this device will save money. It'll do the same clinical diagnostic test and cost half as much for these 4 reasons. That has got to be obvious. I've left it out a couple of times, kind of sort of, or didn't pay much attention to it, and got attacked immediately by reviewers saying, hey, what about this other thing? Oh, by the way, how much would that thing cost? Hey, where's the proof that it would cost that much? Proof that it will cost that much. What does that have to do with the phase 1? Well, it means the reviewer doesn't trust you. You're going to make a machine for 10 times or less cost that does something, a machine that costs 10 times more to build, based on what? If you make a claim like that, coming back to this other point, you need to back it up. If you say this is going to cost 10 times, that's an outsized claim. You have to have something that justifies that. So expect to put a paragraph in there or some table that shows cost of parts or something to that effect that addresses it. So this is an omission, and I really wish the people at NIH would. There's been this huge push to standardize forms across all these different programs, and I understand the wisdom in that, but I also see a huge omission in that. Charles?
We're close to a halfway point whenever is good for you. Give people a little bit of a break.
University-based collaborators, big deal. And for these reasons, bolsters the application profile, subcontract supported patient subject access. I talked about this earlier. If you're going to need access to some sample of Alzheimer's patients or whatever, you're really talking about working with some university-based teaching hospital and having a subcontract wherein some authority in this field or someone who works in this field has access to these patients and can, provide that in this kind of a mechanism. Independent arm's length study results. This is huge. So let's say you go in and do this study with Alzheimer's patients and you have a new way to diagnose early stages of Alzheimer's. Well, who says so? It's, I've seen reviewers question this kind of a proposition wherein the applicant is left to comment on their own the study results, and it raises an uncomfortable kind of a feeling, but it's nice to have the progress report and study results come from an independent source, the people who did the study, rather than the small business saying, yep, everything worked perfect. And I can't tell you the number of times I've seen in proposals I've written, and the applicant has been careful to have an arm's length or independent entity that will evaluate the data and results and include that in the progress report. Big deal. It provides a world of insulation against criticism, and it's a great way to go. I included, this is a proposal I'm working on now. This will give you some idea of the kinds of participants, co-investigators in a study. And this is an outside study. This is looking at this cerebral palsy risk identification system. And so there's all kinds of people involved from different universities. And in fact, this study has expanded quite a bit since this was funded, because we, for complex reasons, larger sample size. But this is what a senior key personnel statement might look like. And this is kind of an outsized project. And I've seen projects that have so many key personnel, they go into the next page. But sometimes you just need a lot of people. There's just too many other people involved. This is just, I thought might be interesting to see an example of what this might look like.
This was a phase 1 or phase 2?
This is a phase 1. This is an outsized phase 1. Very large phase 1. And we're going to get to that shortly. Advisory committee, very similar to having, and you saw some of the people in this statement I had are on an advisory committee. Well, what's that? It's a group of thought leaders, experts in this field, who will agree to act as a consultant and be available during the project period in case something goes wrong, you need their advice, you need input from an expert, and to participate in reviewing and commenting on your study results. Again, we're coming back to this independent confirmation thing. They, in no small way, bolster your application profile. Yes?
How should you balance when you're kind of building these expert panels and showing you how their support, putting them on as advisory committee versus keeping some that aren't paid on the grant as letters of support, or others, like, I go out and talk to a lot of people, I'm like, I would love to have you as a consultant, but I also want letters of support that aren't financially tied to the grant at the same time. So,
In reviewers' minds, that's not a problem. They understand that I usually budget $1,500 to $2,500 for these people for 5 hours of their time to review study results and comment on them, something like that.
but then you shouldn't have them as letters of support because you're paying them a consultant.
No, you do need that letter on their letterhead, absolutely. And even though, I mean, I've never seen that questioned in session.
I guess, so.
I understand your point.
Separated letters of commitment from letters of support as a potential expert saying, yes, this product is needed. So they had a separate 2 letters of the product is needed by someone independent from your project saying, I would buy this if it existed.
Yes.
Versus letter of commitment saying, I will work as a consultant.
Yes.
So I guess for NIH, they're kind of have less emphasis on the letter of support from the independent body.
Reviewers, coming back to what reviewers want, I mean, the NIH is second to the party here in determining funding. What reviewers think is 90% of this. What program directors think it comes after that 90% is decided. And reviewers are generally only too happy to see someone have experts engaged in an SBIR project, even if they're being paid. And I understand your point about potential conflict, but in general, thought leaders, for example, in the field of Alzheimer's disease that I've worked with, I mean, they really don't even care about being paid some amount of money to review some study. It's irrelevant to them. It's something they've got to declare in a conflict of interest thing anyway. These days, you have to jump through a lot of hoops even to accept a $500 consulting fee for an hour of your time, whatever. But yeah, reviewers are only too happy to see that. Reviewer confidence, we just talked about, formally engages experts who are otherwise kind of not formally engaged. Independent confirmation of outcomes, we talked about that. An interpretation of study results, where that interpretation might be very significant. Some studies are cut and dry and some are not. And to have an expert interpret the results is very valuable. Letters of support, we just talked about. Today, they're really a de facto requirement in SBIRs. You have letters of support of various kinds, people saying exactly like the point you were making, this is a product we would use in our clinic, is a very, very powerful statement. It deflects a tremendous amount of potential criticism, including commercialization. We understand that you are competing. You're competing against very experienced multiple award winners 90% of the time. These are the people, and some people have complained to program directors and NIH officials about the guys who seem to get funded a lot. And why is that? One of the reasons is they're very good at what they do. But there's been concern about this raised over and over because these guys know the system. They understand the game, as it were. And they know what to say, what not to say, because they've tested the waters many times and have been reviewers. And in fact, one of the reasons a lot of people who are experienced grant writers participate in reviews is not for the small fee that they get. It's to keep their finger on the pulse of the current review kind of zeitgeists, or MEMS, if you will, of what's happening. And so it's something to be aware of, that if you get a poor score, in CSR, reviewers instruct the reviewers repeatedly to spread their scores in a given session. And somehow
At some point, you're going to talk about proprietary information.
Yes. In fact, yes. This is a really tough problem. So let's say you have a project you want to do, and the normal limits, stated normal limits, statutory limits, $150,000, 6 to 12 months for a phase 1. Phase 2, $1 million limit, 2 years. What if you need to exceed guideline limits? What if your project just doesn't fit into that? I saw an incredible project. Go to the next slide because this kind of loosens things up a little bit. Nothing up my sleeve except my watch. Wait a minute, what happened to the 151 million? Well, we're talking about specifically NIM. We're talking about neurology right now. They have a lot of outsized projects. Say, well, you can exceed that by 50% with appropriate justification from the applicant. That means contact the program director in advance with this one page of bullet points that you'll hopefully find a way to get their attention. And if you don't get their attention and they ignore it completely, submit the proposal anyway and say, hey, I sent you that email twice. Well, why didn't you read it? Now the application lands in their desk. So you need justification for this, and you can exceed the time limits as well. Does anybody know what's coming next?
Exceeding the 225.
Wait a minute, what's going on around here? Now we're up to 700,000 for a phase 1 and 3 million for a phase 2. What happened to the, well, in the case of NINDS, they do, these neurological devices and things require great amounts of money. This is not true for all NIH divisions, by the way, but this is not the only one it's true for. And I've seen these incredible outsized budgets that are really thoroughly justified, and you can't attack the applicant for them at all. So I saw a project that was about to get stranded of one of the most extraordinary value propositions I've ever seen in an SBIR. And the applicant, the biggest problem with it was, instead of running a validation study, which would have cost a lot of money in this case, they were trying to stick to the 225K limit. And by doing so, really compromised this. And I guess the applicant didn't know. You could call up the program director, this particular division that I know, and it'd be a 2-minute conversation and out. And tell them what you're doing, send them a 1-page thing. The value proposition is extraordinary, literally life-saving stuff, a huge impact, huge impact. And just call them up and say, I need to go up to 500K, and here are 3 reasons why. And 90% of the time, in my experience, they would say, well, go ahead and do that, and let's see what happens in review. Let's see what reviewers say. Dodging the question of whether you're going to get funded or not very aptly.
Question.
Sure.
So if you're, say, somewhere between the 150 and 225, like, justifiably, how much during review do they have a certain budget? And let's say it's all scientifically justified what your budget is, but is there any benefit to being a little lower in case they just have a little bit left over they're trying to use? Or do you just ask for what you need and try and, as long as it's justifiable, ask for as much as you can?
Ask for as much as you can. And if you need to go over the limits, just justify it. But don't, like this other project I mentioned earlier where the applicant really should have had some, they went right up to the edge. If you read this proposal, it was like, it was a murder mystery missing the last chapter of who did it. I mean, it just left you kind of hanging. And I didn't like that at all, and got into one of the more spirited discussions that I've had over the years behind closed doors. But at any rate, they really should have asked for more money and done even a preliminary measure of validity. And somebody said, well, they'll do that in phase 2. There's projects for which that just doesn't fit right. And there's projects like that for which you could ask for an extra 100K and go run 25 or 30 patients and answer a huge question. Some people would say, I'm not saying this, but I've heard other people say that you're gaming the system. You're deferring that question of validity because you're afraid it's going to come out negative. If you understand my point here. And I'm not saying that. I'm just saying I've heard that. So a lot of these applicants are very, very agile. And again, coming back to this phase 1, phase 2 partitioning and strategy within the SBIR world of how to, push a project forward. This is a very, very experienced applicant in this case.
Should you only ask for 225 if you have a justifiable reason?
I'd say feel free to go beyond it. Get in touch with that program director. And one thing about talking to program directors and communicating, spend a lot of time polishing whatever that paragraph or that page is, because it may be the last 5 minutes you ever get with them. It's just the way it is. These people said they're incredibly busy. I have no idea. Those people are working a lot of Saturday nights. There's no question in my mind. In fact, I had somebody send me a note at 1 or 2 in the morning, East Coast time, in the middle of some big project. And I thought, wow, I was impressed. I was up at that time.
So I would, they don't have much of a staff to work with? Or they don't have staff that they can delegate some of this to?
You mean in the case of a small business?
I'm talking about the reviewer, not the reviewer, but the program director.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Have staff that can.
Yeah, I was saying earlier, if you have trouble getting through a program director, you probably will, then contact one of the staffers, because their names and email addresses are also given in the omnibus solicitation.
Well, in my case, it was just the director and one other person. And I tried contacting the other person as well. To no avail.
That's strange. I'd keep calling them.
Okay.
Yeah, I would be very persistent in that case if it was me. Yeah. How does the review process work? Well, there's a couple of analogies I could come up with. One has to do with a very popular old world food in Germany. Sausage being made, you don't really want to see what happens kind of thing. Something like that. There's my perspective on all this. I've reviewed for more agencies than this, but I've been doing this for a long time. This is just kind of an overview of the process. You submit a grant application, it goes to Center for Scientific Review. Then it's scored. The scores and the summary statement are written up and sent to NIH, and NIH program director makes a decision, funded or not funded. If you're not funded, you revise, resubmit. Pretty straightforward. What about the referral and assignment process? So Center for Scientific Review receives and processes applications, and they're the one responsible for referring, assigning your application to a specific study section. There's many study sections. The way they're organized today, and they've really tightened this up the last 5 years or so, there's usually not more than one study section your application could be reviewed by, given the topic area, but there is overlap, and you should really think about it and go online to CSR's website and look at the roster, the topic areas they cover, and even the roster too for conflicts of interest, or potential conflicts of interest of reviewers who may pose a threat to your application in one way or another, something like that. We can talk about that more if you like, but you're free to request assignment to a particular study section. And over the years, in general, the officer at CSR will follow your request, will grant it. So you can do that. It's not gaming the system, it's just saying I think it's more appropriate for this study section than another one. I've also seen applicants have projects referred to study sections that didn't want it to go through a really tough study section, like the neurology study section, which I served on more than a few times, and it was the most engaging and often raucous group of people, and the SRO in charge of that section had to go to a yellow card, red card system, literally, because a lot of the neurosurgeons and neurologists in these committees did not like it when you disagreed with them. And so they would get really out of control. And so this guy, Keith, would warn everybody, don't test me. And these guys would nonetheless, do that. So I never got yellow carded even. So I was trying to not that it was an exciting committee, but that is a very difficult committee, and so is the radiology committee. In case you have some of these projects, will, even if you request it be sent to a softer committee, they won't entertain that depending on the topic area and their own good judgment about where it should end up. That getting something through neurology is not easy. Yes.
What is the typical background or profile of a reviewer?
Great question. 75% of them are academics in general. 25% are from the small business world, and they have trouble keeping the small business people because they're busy, and the fee they get for the time they spend on these makes no sense whatsoever. Most of these people will do this once and never do it again. The best reviewers from small business I've ever met do this maybe twice, and they're done with it. It's just way too much time, being out of town for 3 days and all these kinds of things. It just doesn't work.
So do people fly into MA?
Yes, to fly into DC and get in a hotel and go through all this stuff for a very small amount of money. I mean, it's a very complex dynamics there, but.
Kind of like jury duty.
Yes, they're very similar. It's something except that for those motivated people, and I've wondered over the years, you see some of these academics, retired academic people on the committee, they enjoy the process and they're very good at it. Even though they may come from behavioral science, you'd be shocked at how incisive their comments are on some technology thing, because they are used to knowing how to vet things. I'm sorry, there's a bunch of questions here. I'm sorry, go ahead.
What are the qualifications that a person would need to become a reviewer?
You have to be invited.
You have to be invited, so
Yep.
you can't, there isn't a pool you can put yourself in.
You could volunteer to do that. You could volunteer to do that, and if all of you considering doing SBIRs could see any 10 or 15 successful proposals and the reviews that went with them, you would learn a world of what you otherwise need to know. But people who write successful SBIRs are very careful about their art, and they are shy to release it to the world for a lot of reasons, a lot of good reasons of proprietary information and all this kind of stuff. And so, but if this is where you've got some great grant writers here at this institution, I would suggest several hundred. Even though they haven't done an SBIR, they can still spot problems in an application. They look for the internal kind of cross-validate ideas and the coherence of it. But this is where some of these outside businesses that do this, I've often suggested a pre-review process to to more than a few people, because it would be so valuable to have experienced reviewers spend even an hour to read an application and tell you whether they find what weak spots they find before you go do this. And for this reason, it's very tough to recover from a poor first score for a couple of reasons. One, reviewers don't like to go. Let's say you scored a 5, and I'm going to go through this in some detail in a few minutes. But you score a 5, reviewers who gave that 5, even when you revise it carefully and address their points, don't like to say they were wrong. Oh, and I made substantial changes in a quarter. People like to go back to the score they originally gave. Well, that's kind of petty and subjective, isn't it? Yeah, it is. So you have to be very careful that this is about this thing about rushing an application too. It's rare to recover from a poor first score. And a poor first round score, I would say was 5.5 or above. A 6 usually means you're not in the game. A 6, I can just tell you, I'm sure there's some exceptions to this that I have never seen, but it's very difficult. Did I answer your question?
You answered a lot of questions.
All right, well, hopefully, yes.
Can you clarify the difference between requesting assignment to a study section versus requesting assignment to the institute? for funding?
Great question. You can always, on the application form, you can request a dual assignment for the funding agency. Have a dual assignment. But that means one or the other will fund it, not both will take part of it.
Okay, but is that the study section that reviews it also? Separate
No.
list of study sections?
There's a separate list of study sections, but when you do the funding agency that you're targeting, you have the option to submit a dual assignment for funding. So if National Institute on Aging doesn't like this, but mental health does, and mental health thinks it's scored, I got into an incredible to-do over this many years ago, a mind-blower story. It was one of the worst brouhahas I ever got into. Was a fight over a proposal I wrote that one agency said, we're not going to fund it. Another agency, the second one said, we will. And the first agency said, well, we're not going to let go of it. So sparks flew. People got upset.
And the outcome?
We got funded. But the process, I could tell a great story sometime over what happened in this. It was a wild ride for 2 months with really powerful people in the Alzheimer's field wanting this funded right now. And a program person saying, I would like to have this project reviewed and in my portfolio. Kind of, sort of. And there were concerns about that among various people, and this thing spiraled up to the head of the agency.
So I take it that you had advocates on the Alzheimer's side that were willing to take the fight.
Yeah, it was very interesting, but that's rare that agencies would fight over your proposal. If you're in that position, consider yourself fortunate. No matter what the political, how many bodies are strewn on the field, you're winning the battle. You're winning a battle. There's another question.
For the assignment process, are you going to touch upon the policy they had last year with the clinical versus non-clinical trial tracks? And when and how that's reviewed, and or is that gone now?
It's a real gamish, to use a term. The whole clinical trials thing this all got stirred up 6-7 years ago, and then now, I don't follow the rules on that because I'm not doing trials per se. Although I've got one coming up, and it's no fun to include a clinical trial in an NIH application for a whole bunch of reasons.
We couldn't even get an answer if ours was a clinical trial or not.
I'm not surprised.
And it was just like, I felt like it would cut us out of the running if we got it wrong, and we were just trying to, the program director wasn't very helpful and just gave a quick response, and then the experts, the human subjects, couldn't answer it either.
Was this coming from the university?
No.
No, as a small business.
It's our small business,
Okay.
and it's an infant behavioral study, and by all their guidelines and paperwork, we're sitting there highlighting things and trying to understand it, and just like trying to ask them beforehand, and nobody could give us an answer if it was clinical trial or not. But they finally did, but like the day before it was due. So I was preparing like both, because I was really worried if we got it wrong, it was just gonna kick us out right away.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, I can tell you one thing, reviewers are not experts in these guidelines either.
Right.
They should be. I've said many things here today, and I feel like I need to qualify. I'm giving you my opinions and my experience, and others would have a different opinion, but in general, reviewers are not any better versed than you are, if that much, on this kind of an issue of what is and what is not a trial. And I'm not sure anybody knows, as you're pointing out, and people don't want to get caught in the middle of these things either. And it's easier to just defer and not answer an email like that, which is not kind of the way it's supposed to work.
I was just curious who is reviewing that, or is everyone just kind of like, I'm not sure, so.
If you submitted like a full clinical trial protocol, reviewers would just roll with it.
So if you submitted a clinical trial, but it wasn't technically a clinical trial by their definition, are they just gonna be like, okay, well, they did more of the paperwork?
Your problem would be with program people at NIH, not with the reviewers at CSR in this case.
Okay, so
It might-
before that.
No, they're gonna, if you do more work than less on an issue like that, you're gonna be fine in review.
That's what I was trying to ask,
My
the way you give-
my comment,
Yeah.
my opinion, yeah.
How much time do you spend on reviewing a specific proposal?
You really wanna know?
Yeah.
It depends on the proposal, so there's that lower 30th percentile I referred to earlier. I probably, to read even a really terrible proposal, I've never spent less than 6 hours to read and write a critique, even in a really poor proposal, because you still have to understand it, and out of fairness to the applicant, no matter how terrible a proposal is, you still owe it to them to be fair in your comment and not just completely dismissive. On the other hand, I spent well over 20 hours on some applications of downloading. I'm one of those reviewers that you may never want reviewing your application, but if I don't understand something or I see outsized assertions, and this device would say 50% because of these, here's 3 references that prove it. If it strikes me as peculiar, I will go download those references immediately and read them. What if there's another 10 references? I'll download those 10 too, and I'll read them. And I spent nearly a week on this one proposal because it was so fascinating. It was an incredible, I wish I could talk about it here because it's an extraordinary potential breakthrough in timing medication administration. And I won't say anything more than that, but it was an extraordinary undertaking. And I spent a week, I was educating myself. I had the time, which I don't anymore. I'm sorry.
So what was it for you or some of the other reviewers that there was an application on the edge report, or what were some things that either pushed it over the edge or sunk it?
Well, I'm going to get to that in the next couple of slides. So, will your application even be discussed? Well, aren't they all discussed in session? No, it's not possible. By definition, about 50%. So CSR receives this many applications based on and reviewers do a review at home or in their office, and they send in scores electronically. Based on that stratification, this determines the ordering of what happens in day 1 of a review. It's 2 days for review. So they discuss the highest scored applications. Then, you don't know the final impact scores. You don't know the 3 reviewers, but everybody in the room listens to the 3 reviewers and then assigns their scores. Those are added up, and that sets the second score stratification, which proposals are discussed on day 2. But by fiat and by limitations on the cost and time, about half of all proposals received are not discussed, and you'll get an indication of that when you will get a summary statement, and you will get reviewers' comments. You will not receive an impact score, and why does this look kind of scary to me, this slide? I kept looking at this slide and I thought, should I, it kind of sounds almost apocalyptic or something, doesn't it? 15 minutes? 15 minutes for what? 15 minutes for your proposal to be judged by. So there's going to be 3 applicants, or 3 reviewers who are assigned to your proposal, and they discuss it in 15 minutes, and then everybody else votes on it, where it assigns their score. And those are tallied electronically. You have 15 minutes, which is everything that you've said and everything you wrote, all the things are hashed out. We're on to the next application. It's a lot. I had a note here. You will note that this is not an iconic smoke-filled back room. There is a high level of transparency in all these processes. The process of review, initial scores are requested by, this is what happens in these 15 minutes. Reviewers 1, 2, and 3, please give your preliminary scores. They give their scores, they turn on the microphones. The primary reviewer sets the tone. The primary reviewer, the first reviewer, gets out of those 15 minutes, about 7 to 8 minutes, roughly speaking. And these things vary all over the place, and they're constantly, people are being reined in by the chair, and sometimes by the SRO if they're really, things are going sideways. So they set the tone, the first reviewer, and you'll see that in your review statement. In general, most of the reviewers in the room will tend to side with the primary reviewer. They're the one who's supposed to spend the most time on this. They're the one who's supposed to be the expert in it. So other reviewers will be more strongly swayed, in general, by what, so when you read your summary statement, of course you would read the primary reviewer's comments first. They're ordered that way. Second and third reviewers follow up, primarily emphasizing difference with the primary. Then there's an open discussion. Anybody can turn their microphone on and say, ask questions of the reviewers or whatever. Chair summarizes the discussion. People with incredible memories. I don't have no idea how the chairs these do it, but they, out of a 15, 20-minute discussion, they can pull out the 15 salient points and amazingly read them back up to everybody in the room and then finalize. Reviewers state their final scores, setting the range. And then you're free to vote inside the range or outside the range, depending on where you think a proposal lies. Maybe the range was, the best score was a 2 and the best score was, the other score was a 5. Well, you may think it's worse than that. You want to score to 7. If you think it's not that great of a proposal, you have to raise your hand. They get people who are out of the range. So you may see this in discussion, and I could, question back?
So for the reviewers, does everyone have every copy of the proposal?
Yep.
Or okay, and is it practice that everyone reads all the proposals, or do they score just based on the discussion that's occurred?
90% of the time, they're listening to the discussion. A lot of diligent reviewers who have sat next to me, whose laptop screens I could see easily. I've noticed them pull up the electronic application, the PDFs, and be looking at them while people are discussing. But really, how much can you learn in 15 minutes about a proposal? So it tends to go another direction. The principal scoring axes: significance, investigators, innovation, approach, environment. We've talked about all these, but these are the 5 scoring axes that each reviewer assigns a number to. And then there's the scientific merit, scientific rigor question. This came up, I don't know, it seems like not too many years ago. How much scientific merit and rigor are embodied in this application? I think this came from somebody at HHS. I'm not sure, but it kind of came from right field to me. It's kind of a good question, but reviewers are stringently advised to comment specifically on how scientifically meritorious and rigorous are the methods, statistics, whatever, your sampling method, etc., and to comment on that. It's not a score. It's not a separate score. And this all funnels down to the impact score. The impact score is the main criteria used by NIH to decide on funding. Takes into account sub-scores of the 5 axes, but unlike many years ago, the overall score was a simple numerical average of the 5 sub-scores. It is not an average now. It is a gestalt made by a reviewer. So when you see your impact score in an application, a lot of things have gone into that, and what I'm trying to do is unpack that right now and give you a feel for what happened, what might have happened, and be able to, hopefully, it'll inform your grant writing and your ability to respond to this. How to interpret an impact score? Well, here's NIH's take on all this. This is these are interesting words. Somewhat deferential, I would say. What if you have something that's fair impact, a 7? Something that has some significant flaws, but it will have fair impact. What do we mean by impact? Well, impact on the healthcare system. How many patients will this impact? By how much? Well, how would reviewers know that? Well, they make a gestalt. They read the application, they listen to the discussion, and they make a judgment. What kind of impact will this have overall? See, it's not just the mechanics of the application. It's not just the subscores. It's their perception, their gestalt of what perception, what impact this will have in the patient population it's targeted at. A couple of comments. You rarely see 1s and you rarely see 9s. I don't think I've ever seen a 1. I've assigned a 1 a couple of times, but it didn't end up being the final score. But usually these scores will come in between for good reasons. So interpreting your score. Let's say you get a score of 1 to 3 somewhere. This is a little bit off, by the way. I'm going to get into Payline in a minute here, but generally you're funded with a score between 1 and 3. In this case, you're waiting for to submit just-in-time materials, the JIT, some of you may be familiar with, and waiting for a notification of award, the NOA. Generally, if you're scoring, this is a little bit off. I blame my assistant for this error, but please bear with me here. But basically, above 3, and I'm going to talk about pay lines in the next slide, you're going to be resubmitting. What if you get a 6 or above? You really need to reconsider your application and maybe reformulate the whole thing. Reviewers are telling you that they have a more than a small problem with the value proposition or the methods or something. And you can read the summary statement, but really you're probably going to have to reformulate all this. Here's an interesting slide, and with an interesting word, with payline, which is a term that's been around forever. And many people at NIH will tell you there's no such thing as a payline because it moves constantly. And we don't really use paylines. We do. I've heard all kinds of things. And in fact, I tell you a story. Years ago, I had a project of high program relevance. We were computerizing the kind of gold standards for Alzheimer's clinical trials to assess drug efficacy. And the director of NIA was keen to see this happen. And we got a score of, I think we got, it was like a 2.5 or something. And I called him up, and it's the first time I ever talked to him. My call went right through, amazingly. Good planetary alignment or something, I don't know. And I was really kind of hesitant to, force a comment or something, and I was trying to be as tactful as I could. And I said, well, we got a 2.5 in this, and I was calling to ask if we're within the pay line, if we're going to fall below the pay line. I said, just wanted to ask you where the pay line was on this round. And there was a long pause in the other end of the line, and this voice said, I don't know. Where do you think it is? What do you mean where I think? I think it's above the score we got. That's what. And this guy was known for a kind of wry sense of humor and toying with applicants. And he was somebody who controlled a tremendous amount of money and was awfully tired of being chased by highly motivated, highly skilled grant applicants. And I struck up a friendship with him over the years, and we had some great conversations about all kinds of things, and a distraction from a busy workday, talking about absolutely nothing, like a Seinfeld episode or something, I don't know, that kind of thing. But in fact, what happens in a perfect world is a program director's decisions of fund or not fund are very easy when they fall below a 3 and there's no clustering of scores. What happens when there's clustering of scores around 3, which happens on almost every round? You get this clustering of scores. Even though reviewers are advised, don't cluster your scores. Be sure to spread your scores within the range of the proposals we're reviewing today. It still happens. In fact, the score clustering is typically these days around 3 and 5. And because reviewers have a certain idea in their head about what a 3 is and what a 5 is. And as many times as the SROs try to re-educate them and recalibrate them, This is going to happen over and over. I'm just saying, they changed the whole scoring system, it was 10 or 12 years ago, maybe it was 15, I forget, something like that, at trying to get rid of this problem of clustering, and it's come right back for the reasons that applicants are very tuned in to what they need to do, and they're very skilled, and they follow the same kind of rule book in general, and they're very good at competing. So it's kind of inevitable that they're going to have these scores come up of around 3, and reviewers are stringently advised to ignore anything resembling a pay line notion in the assignment of their scores. Does that mean they do that? No. In my opinion, no. Reviewers know full well if they assign a 6 to an application, it will likely never be funded. And they know full well they assign a 3 or 4 or even a 5. A 5 to a lot of people means fix it. You're not out of the running, a 5 in general. A 5 in an R1 or R21, an academic grant, is usually game over. You're usually never going to recover from it. But in SBIR, speak, that means fix it in general. Got to read the comments. Any questions about this before you? Okay. What is an ND? No, not discussed. And actually what you'll see on your summary statement are 2 plus signs where the score should have been. And you will be advised that your application was not discussed. I was just in a review committee session, and I scored a proposal incredibly well, and 2 other, I think I may have mentioned this, but it's worth revisiting perhaps in this context of people, 2 reviewers and even 1 reviewer. As a single reviewer myself, have pulled assigned scores I thought were fully justified and pulled a proposal out of being discussed. It's just because the merit was sufficiently low, but it only takes 1 reviewer to, so when you get an ND, it's not the end of the world. It can mean a lot of things. And you have to start with, in interpreting all this, understand reviewers have limited time to review your application. We talked about that earlier. Limited expertise. As much as SROs at CSR try to match this up, there's going to be limitations. The hesitance to revise scores in session, I mentioned this before. Reviewers are people too. Reviewers make decisions, and you're asking them for their opinion. And they can say what they want, and they do say what they want. And I've had reviewers review my applications who I thought should not be allowed to. In fact, I had an application where we had the primary came down hard, and he said there was, he gave us a 7 or an 8, and reviewers 2 and 3 both scored 2 and 3, or 2 and 1 or something. We would have been easily funded if reviewer 1 hadn't been in the picture. Huge project. And I had a big problem with that. Because his main criticism was there's no previous validation studies for this illness management and recovery program. Well, it happened there were 4 which we cited, more than 1 place in the application. So after this review, I sent the SRO a note saying, by the way, reviewer 1 is wrong here. We cited the validation studies in the literature. And he's saying there are none. Here are 4. He sent me back, he said, well, just revise and resubmit and emphasize this in the revision, which we did. We mentioned in the introduction to the application, in the abstract, in specific aims and significance. Results of the second review came right back and said, no, there's no validation studies to this. So I called up the SRO and I said, I would like a reassignment of the review. He said, well, write this all up. Send me a PDF letter, what your reasons are, and I'll think about it. They can't tell you anything like, yes, of course, your will is my will. I mean, it's just not going to happen. But it turns out that he didn't reassign this reviewer. And so we never finished a phase 2 of one of these projects, and it was very surprising. Today, and they will not answer questions about, and just tell you in so many words, don't bug me. Send in, your rationale for this, and I'll make a decision, and I can't make any promises. Even when something like this happens, when a reviewer is clearly letting a personal bias interfere with their objectivity. Yes?
So it sounds like you actually get a lot of feedback, including what each of the individual reviewers scored, as well as what the overall score is?
Yeah?
Okay.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm just curious, what is the actual feedback you get after?
You'll get a summary statement that's about 10 or 12 pages long.
And sorry, the last thing, who writes that up? Is that the chair?
The chair, and then it's reviewed by the SRO. Yep.
Just an anecdote along the lines that you just covered. Something like this happened to me once. This was back in the 90s. And I was able to figure out the reviewer, who it was, because, my field is pretty small. And he was upset because I hadn't referenced one of his papers. And so on the resubmission, I referenced his paper, which wasn't really terribly germane, but I referenced it anyway, and it was awarded.
It's not supposed to work that way. But you're right.
How often that sort of thing happens.
I go back to the bullet point on reviewers are people too. And this happens even in some terrible things happen in academic grant reviews that I've seen, of all kinds of personal factors coming into play. But you got to live with it. I once had a horrible marginal score on a really outstanding project, and I went to a mentor of mine at UC Irvine that I'd known for many years, probably the greatest grant writer. I'm fortunate to have been, associated with him, and he looked at me, and I was really more than angry about it. It was really an uncalled for review in all kinds of ways, and I know the difference. And he goes, "Well, what do you want?" Vengeance first. Right? When you're really, mistreated like that, or you have your application abusively reviewed, someone might say, and it was a stare down thing, and he goes, "Do you want to get funded or complain?" I said, "Well, let's take that in 2 parts. Let's start with the complaint part first, and then start with the funding part." And he goes, "I'm surprised." He goes, "You've seen this for so many years." I said, "Yeah, we really need this project," and yada yada. And he said, "Just revise it." He goes, "You know the deal." He goes, "You got to roll with it." But sometimes even really experienced people like this are, and he had a project years ago. A quick anecdote here. He was way ahead in the field and looking for markers of fetal distress during fetal development. And they started off with looking at beta endorphin levels and amniotic fluid. Fascinating stuff. They've continued on. And he had a proposal that was ahead of its time, submitted it, and got killed in review. Make a long story short, a poor score. And I said, "What did you do?" And he goes, "Well, I set it aside for 3 years because I knew the committee well. And I knew the score was not going to change no matter what I did. They did not understand what we were doing or why it was valuable. We were 3 years ahead of the literature, and these guys were." So he waited 3 years, took it out, dusted it off, updated the references, submitted it, and got it funded in the first round. Sometimes it's a matter of waiting out a reviewer. You may have, like even in this other project I mentioned, some reviewer is going to stand in the way, and for personal reasons and for being just stubborn. And it does happen. Coming back to this bullet point here that's dogging us. What can go wrong in review? Reviewer misunderstanding, poorly justified comments, bias, possibly, yes. All these kinds of things, and you're just going to have to play the game. And it's very difficult, very painful to have your artwork criticized and attacked when it's and it's clear that it is unjustified. And there's nothing, what Bill Gates was famous for saying not too many years ago, "Life is unfair, get over it." Easy for him to say today, right? Not so easy to say if you're doing this kind of thing, you have a small business or some other project you've been working on for 15 years and nurturing it, and somebody callously rejects it. Here's what to pay attention to. You asked me about summary statement. The summary statement is a long document, but you want to pay special attention to the resume and summary of discussion. These are the chair's recollections, and I think most of these chairs must be able to take shorthand. I have no idea how they remember all this stuff, and then they review this really fast right before they summarize the scores and ask for the final. So you want to read that carefully and read between the lines of it, because that's where really the most important thing you're going to find. You will have the description of the project is basically copy and paste of your abstract and summary statement, and then you're going to have the critiques from each one of the reviewers, and they're going to go through their litany of things they had problem with on all those 5 axes. And in a revision, you're going to have to deal with as many of them as you can. You have 1 page, and you have to pick the ones that you respond to. Pick the ones first, deal with the 7 or 8 issues, 5 or 6 issues, 3 or 4 issues that are in this section. They're telling you what was discussed live and in person and what was most salient, because reviewers may these reviews that they wrote before they came to the study section may have changed. Their mind may have been changed. They may have misspoken or misrepresented something in their written comments that are now etched in concrete, pretty much, kind of, sort of. You actually have a few days after the review to go ahead and change your comments in case something changed. You're supposed to be a diligent reviewer and follow up. But pay attention to that section, and do try to answer these first in the introduction if you have to revise, and second, go to these. Responding to a review. Carefully study the summary statement, as I mentioned. And in the event that you get a horrible review and somebody really did not make the effort to understand what you're saying, or simply rejected really sound assertions that you made, and you have to write this introduction and be kind and polite, even though you may not feel kind and polite at the moment, you're going to have to, do something like take a deep breath first and say something like, hey, try reading my proposal more carefully, please. I was asking too much of you. And I've seen naive applicants tear into reviewers in their introductory statement. This will not win you any points. You just have to be as deferential as you can. There's no experienced grant writers here know the game well. The first thing my mentor taught me years ago, and I saw one of these revisions, I was learning all this stuff many years ago, and he said, the first thing he'd say, that's an excellent criticism. It's an excellent comment. No matter how misguided it was, it was one of his bag of tricks of saying it's an excellent observation, whether you respond to it in substance or not. Right? This isn't all being deferential. This is an excellent comment. And moving on to the next comment. What can you say? What can you say if you disagree? Sometimes you do have to call out reviewers, and I've done it before. I had somebody was kept saying in this project we're working on now, this cerebral palsy risk identification thing, we're looking at 2 different technologies to measure infant arm and leg movements. We're using accelerometers that are ultra miniaturized, and we're using the 3D, these new Intel 3D camera things that are a real pain to look at. And he kept saying over and over and over, why develop 2 parallel technologies? We were not. We stated from the beginning, we're comparing them. Because in a previous review, someone had asked us to do this. And here was a new set of reviewers saying, what on earth are you developing 2? It was very clear. So in the introduction to the application, all over the revised application, we are not developing 2 new technologies in parallel. We are comparing them to determine which one is best in real-world clinical terms for phase 2 development. Over and over and over. Next review of the project, same thing. Right back to the same comment. hey, try reading my proposal a little bit, would you? I mean, what do you have to do to get their attention? This just happens. And what someone could say, well, how lazy is that? Well, reviewer can go, it's very easy to go right back to your previous review and not spend a lot of time on it. Yeah, but that's not being diligent at all. It's not being fair at all. Reviewers are free to say what they want. That is a highly guarded process, and it is a totally taboo for anybody at CSR to in any way, shape, or form guide or steer any reviewer. There's incredible injunctions and strictures in place. If anything like this ever happened, you'd be out of a job in quick. But you just can't do that. You can't interfere. So reviewers are free to say whatever they want. That doesn't mean that the SROs aren't free to release them as a reviewer if they keep getting complaints or they see something that really is way out of line. They see really naive comments, they'll try to find a replacement, but it's not easy to replace reviewers. Not everybody has those 3 days to give, plus the 2 weeks before the review. I mean, all this work that has to be done, not everybody's up for that. Question.
So is there a good way to avoid crusty reviewers and issues with study groups?
Well, I could start with prayer as one possibility. I'm sorry, I'm just getting over a cold, but no, there is no good way to do that. You can't really know, even the ostensible expertise of a particular committee may not suit your application. And, excuse me, who gets assigned to your application is the SROs doing their best job to match the topic to the known skill sets, but it could be a mismatch. And between the time that you initially submit a proposal to the time it's reviewed once or twice could change. So
roll the dice.
It is a roll. It's again, as I said earlier, a legal form of gambling with a lot of your time.
Yeah.
Sorry, you had some other question.
I was curious, can they give any general reminders of the appropriateness for like SBIRs, like what's appropriate for phase 1 versus phase 2? Like if we got a lot of comments on our phase 1 that seem more like, well, that's the work we'll be doing in phase 2 is kind of a weakness, like doing it in a specific patient population versus just kind of general proof of concept. Do they ever kind of remind people, like, I'm curious how skilled the reviewers are at knowing what's appropriate for phase 1 versus just a general, this would be an awesome research project if only they did this too, just outside the scope of that.
This comes back to the issue of context dependence and project-specific goals and needs. I've rarely heard that of people doing too much in a phase 1. I've heard the opposite 95% of the time at least. And I talked about this earlier. My suggestion and advice to you is to do more in a phase 1, to overpromise than underpromise. But it's every proposal is unique, and you have to read this. You have to put yourself in the position of a reviewer and try to somehow. Have you ever written an application or a long paper and set it aside for 2 months and gone back and picked it up and wonder who changed it all around before you in the middle of the night or something? Well, this is the same thing, and this is a practical kind of comment on writing these kinds of applications and not being rushed, which is almost impossible. I mean, people are busy, right? I mean, how much time do you have to finish an application 3 months before it's due and then set it aside for a month or two and then come back to it? But I can't tell you the number of times I've done something similar to that only to discover to my horror that someone had gotten into my office and had edited that document and made it. It's a really frightening thing, and read some of these things like, how did that get in there? This paragraph's completely out of, how did I not notice that? And it's scary because you're like, well, what else is wrong with this? I mean, how far does this go? Should I even read the rest of this application before I, take an aspirin or something? I mean, it's a scary, it's a sinking feeling. And that's where this extra second pair of eyes things comes in, and having, if you've got any mentors, anybody who's experienced at this who can read your application and give you an independent take on it, get them something for Christmas or think of some way to connect with them, because that kind of advice is invaluable. Yeah.
Are reviewers given mandates? Because I know you said that they, within one session, they should give a wide range.
Yep. Yep.
Or at least evenly distribute. So is there any other mandate in terms of, to only try to get the imaginary pay line to fund a third for budgetary reasons, or we're only trying to grant this much money? It just,
No.
Okay.
No.
So in theory, there could be an entire session of funds.
Correct. It could happen. I wouldn't bet on it. That's like winning the lottery 20 times in a row or something. But no, I've never seen a one assigned. But I know a guy who just got a $15 or $20 million center grant with a 1.1 at UC Irvine. Yeah, that is none other than the amazing Dr. Cooper, who's he called me up one night. We were working on this cerebral palsy project together, and I knew he's a director of the ICTS, the Translational Science Center at UC Irvine. It's one of the biggest in the country. This guy's incredibly busy. And he called me at home at night, and I knew something was up. It's usually the other way around. And I knew he was dying to tell me something, and he was holding back and holding back. He was talking about this IRB, this multi-center IRB, and all these issues. If you've never been through a multi-center IRB, dealing with premature infants, you have not been through the grinder yet of current day regs and strictures of accessing that patient population. At any rate, he finally got it out that he'd gotten a 1.1 in this project, and that is unbelievable. That's like winning 5 gold medals at the Olympics for anybody who doesn't understand that. I was at a couple of meetings where he mentioned that, and people were like, oh, that sounds good. Well, it's more than that. It's almost impossible. But he's that good at it. He would, a lot of this, I've given presentations in this group before, and I wanted just to finish up on a couple of, where are we at time-wise?
We have a half an hour if we're going to stay true to the
Okay.
2 hours.
I can take, I'm at the end of my slides. If anybody would like to, I can entertain any and all questions on projects. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Questions on intellectual property,
Huh.
specifically denoting that what is proprietary or confidential.
Great idea, and it's a necessity. And even though a lot of these reviewers have never run a small business, have never developed a technology, I've seen they know enough, they've seen enough over many years to call out an applicant who doesn't pay attention to what is the IP in this. Not in those terms, but and even if you work with a university, like we're developing university-based IP, held IP, we have a license to do that. They'll ask really strange questions because they kind of don't read what we're already put into the application. But you do need to be clear about that, about what is, and usually this happens commonly in the phase 2 commercialization section, but they expect you to mention it in the body of the application as well.
Sure.
So you have to
I
search
meant
for it.
in the sense of denoting that this is confidential information, not.
Oh, you mean releasing confidential information?
Correct.
Great point. Reminds me of something else, a recent change in the program guidelines that they've advised everybody. I think it was just 2 years ago. Correct me if anybody here is up on this issue. Anything you put in an abstract, now they used to only release the project narrative, which was 3 sentences, 4 sentences. That was public domain, quick. Now, if you get funded, your entire abstract is posted online and anybody can see it. So what we've seen are highly watered down, diluted abstracts that say next to nothing. My advice to you is to ignore that, by the way, and put everything. The abstract and summary is the one thing you can be sure reviewers will carefully read. And I spend a great deal of time writing and rewriting so that every phrase in that 30 lines, you get 30 lines, is highly meaningful and flows perfectly.
Yeah, well, what I'm concerned about is if you're going to get a patent on something, and you've actually disclosed patentable ideas, is that, the issue is, in principle, I suppose, that can be considered a public disclosure, unless you've so identified.
You can identify that. You can.
Yes, but let's say you don't. What happens?
Well, you're going to have to, in the body of the application, this is something to talk to a program director about, if it's something that critical. Typically, my kind of my street smarts on this kind of stuff are that most people who have IP that they regard as highly valuable, most people in the world in their field would not regard as that valuable because it's either undeveloped, unlikely to ever be developed. And a lot of people, I'm not saying you shouldn't worry about IP, release of information and things, but typically inventors' perceptions of how likely their ideas are to be stolen by someone are.
Well, in my case, I am an
Excessive.
expert in the field and have been an expert witness in a number of lawsuits.
Mm.
So, I do have good judgment on this. My concern is, if down the road a contest comes up as far as when was something made public, and this is extremely important on your timing for patents, particularly for PTC. And the issue is what is considered a public disclosure, in which what can be released. For example, if a reviewer looks at it and say, hey, that's a great idea, and then starts talking to his buddies about it, then that would be considered a public disclosure, and hence would start up one.
It'd be a very illegal disclosure, by the way, because to get into that room, I showed you the 15-minute slide, to get into that room, you sign off on all kinds of highly legalistic agreements about disclosure, and in fact, you're not even allowed to discuss projects at lunch that you just reviewed. You leave that room, there is no discussion of any project. This doesn't make it impossible for someone with a vested interest to disclose something that they saw in a review, but I'd be very careful about doing that. And I know people who know people about people who've been caught disclosing results of a review, and you're really in some hot water. They take it very seriously.
So basically, a reviewer's under an NDA on any ideas that they disclose.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
So basically, the proposal is not in any way form considered a public
No.
document.
The proposal itself, and someone asked a question a while ago about freedom of information requests on funded proposals, and I don't remember the answer off the top of my head, I'm sorry, but I know that the abstracts, once they're funded, the abstracts are made public. But use your best judgment, and you can request it's a great question, and just to try to finish this, you can request that certain portions of a proposal never be disclosed. But check the application guidelines on that, because they do go into this in some detail.
Yeah.
And I don't know what the latest, they've changed on this over the years, and I don't follow all the nuances.
Well, basically, they said, look, if we get hit with a freedom of information disclosure, too bad, we're going to disclose it.
You can mark some portions proprietary.
You can.
Yeah.
And the question, well, that I don't know.
I think there's some exemptions from market, but I have to check
I
on
see.
that too.
But if it isn't marked, then what? And I know that there's a process you can request, hey, I missed this in the proposal, please change it to proprietary. But evidently, that's an extreme situation if you request that after it's been submitted.
I guess I'm suggesting contacting that program director you have trouble with in the past, is to ask them about a question like this, because they're really the ones responsible for this. And if you're really having, sounds like it's a smaller division of NIH to me from what you're describing.
That's correct.
Yeah, so they almost worth keeping an eye, because they kind of tour around the country. These guys are, I know the Society for Neuroscience and other places, they have huge presentation areas that they've paid for and reserved, so they're available, and just walk right up to them, and they kind of can't avoid you then if they've been doing so.
If you're going to really fundamentally start a business, it's your intellectual property is your meat and potatoes. That's it.
Yeah.
And that you have to be extremely sensitive on it, and that's why I'm kind of.
Let me comment on this. You raised another interesting question that just came up in a project. So I was asked to advise a lady at UC Irvine who's developed some new technology that I can't talk in detail about, but she's devised something very interesting, and it has potential a huge impact. And she went to the IP people at UC Irvine and said, here's the invention thing, yada yada, and the attorneys there, probably young attorneys from what I gather, my sense, said, well, there's not really a patentable device in this. There's no electronics you could patent, and I'm not quite sure that even the method can be patented. Pay close attention, everyone. I'm going to tell you something very important. Are there any people from the tech transfer office here? Uh-oh, couple. Well, I'll be as careful and diplomatic as I can, which may not be much, but because I'm going to, the filters are off here. So she was advised, well, we can't. There's not a strong IP position here. So sorry. Well, in this particular case, the IP, nobody makes money off of electronic devices these days. That's very rare. Or a patent on an electronic circuit, very rare. It can happen, but that's usually not where the gold is at all. And what about some method patent? Method patents are very weak. An application patent or something there, that's another weakness here. And then there was a problem there. But really, I think from what I've heard, and I haven't been deep into this issue yet, and it's a long story, but people's schedules are misaligned, but the real gold in this is to get SBIR funding and run 500 patients on this, because then you have something called a database. And then you have something called the calibration factors, correction factors, scaling factors. How does it really work in the real world factors? Well, any company could come and grab your IP, and no, they can't grab the database, and they can't grab all the knowledge you have that makes it work, because that's really where the action's at anyway.
Right.
Then you can go to General Electric or somebody else, these kind of monitoring systems, and then you have something that, well, they could just reproduce your study. They don't do that. It's very, very rare. They can't do a study at anywhere near the cost that a small business can. You've already done it. You've already got that. They may run another study with 500, another 500 or 1,000 patients, but you've already set the tone for that. You already have the validation and the rationale to do it. But then it comes back to working with industry partners, of understanding their roadmap and their priorities, because they don't stray from them. So this person's been out looking for opportunities like that, but the people at the IP tech transfer office kind of didn't see this, and it's not as easy to protect. That's true. That you're almost into the domain of trade secrets kinds of things. But databases can be copyrighted, and those algorithms, those real work in the real world algorithms that only you have and know, are valuable to them, and you can license that to them or whatever. These people in the room are
Right.
familiar with this.
But, going to, for example, a venture capitalist, they're wanting to know where your patents. They want to see your patent
Yep.
portfolio.
Yep.
And even if the patent's not worth much, they still want to see it.
Yep, you're absolutely right. But that's where an industry partnership thing, if you find an industry partner that already has this in their roadmap, the thing you're working on, the particular patient population and goal, then and these people, I can't speak for the group here. I'm sure all very talented and well informed, but the group at UC Irvine has exceptional outreach with industry. They have these guys are one-on-one with all these VPs of this and that at all these big companies, and they've got an excellent, dare I use the term, Rolodex, going back to the days when you didn't have electronic devices to have all your phone numbers, but their Rolodexes of industry partners and people who they know well are very impressive. But I think they missed a ball in a situation like this of where this should be going and why and how, and so I'm committed to turning the table over on that and coming up shortly, because I think it's a really great project. Question?
Yeah, I'm just curious. So you've talked about having universities, and the cachet that the university brings. I'm curious if is there a cachet between, say, Duke versus University of San Francisco, or what about, like, here in Portland we have Legacy Research, we have Providence Cancer, are those seen equivalently, or?
No, to reviewers, it's pretty much all the same. I mean, with the possible exception that if you have real known, recognized thought leaders in a field, reviewers, would they know in the Alzheimer's field a difference between Leon Thal, Lon Schneider, or other people in this field versus somebody who's an Alzheimer's expert in somewhere in North Carolina? Probably not. People if you were submitting an R1 or R21, they would know exactly who who these people are and what their presence connotes in terms of them being on board with a project. You can mention that in SBIR. You can go out of your way to to point out this person's prominence in this field. But no, it's not. I wouldn't say so. As long as there's this same kind of a presentation, the source of it's not that. Somebody said years ago that in multi-center trials funded by NIH, some reviewers, and I'm not saying this was something I heard, no really, that having East Coast universities be part of a network was a good idea. I don't have any idea whether that's true. That's just something I heard.
We had the FDA tell us, Knight Cancer Institute, what's that? So.
Well,
Saying.
yeah, no, I understand having these large, high-flying institutions involved in a project is a plus. It impresses reviewers immediately, but at the end of the day, a validation study, I've seen guys get projects approved using private clinics that nobody's ever heard of and will never hear of, but everything else lines up. I mean, they have the CV for the guy that's at the clinic who's going to be running the trial, and everything is good to go. So that's just one comment. Yeah.
One comment on the proprietary thing, and then a question on resubmission. So I will say, I went to DOD, and there wasn't such a situation of proprietariness, because we made everyone come and get talks about grants from us, including to their peers, other grantees in the audience. And I don't know their NDA situation, but we had one investigator just refuse to touch on some technical points, because she said it was proprietary, and the DOD was going to have to tell us. She's like, I'm not saying this is involving other peers in the audience. So that didn't seem like a resolution to that situation. And then for resubmission, so if you have a borderline score and there's no pay line, or you're slightly above the published pay line,
A 3.5, 4?
whatever you think the pay line should be, and the next deadline's coming up, if you could we got a vague guidance, just like a kind of phone call, just wait out this deadline and see what happens. And we were like, I don't want to miss the next deadline and miss the opportunity. So does the government see it as a problem to resubmit if they were going to fund you anyways, or should you just go ahead and do that, just have a buffer, even though they tell you to wait it out and just see what happens with your proposal?
You're way ahead of the game here. This is an advanced question from an advanced applicant. I've been in this exact situation, and years ago, you could call a program director when you got a good score and ask them. With the exception of this one program director I mentioned who liked to prank people and have fun at it. But generally they will tell you, you used to tell you on the phone, you're funded or not. You don't have to go through a process of waiting and waiting and waiting, because as you may well know, and I think part of what you're referring to is a lot of people are sent requests for just-in-time materials now that are definitely not going to get funded.
Right.
But the problem is, again, coming back, there's this stack of proposals on the program director's desk that are all scored between 2.8 and 3.2, let's say. Now, which one do you fund? Do you fund the 2.8 over the 3.2 based on the numerical difference, or do you fund it on? And this is where you'll be asked, and typically one of the steps that you're very close to being funded is when they ask you to write a rebuttal to the review. So when you get a request for just-in-time materials, and after that, you may quickly get a request for even before, to be perfectly clear, a request for a rebuttal. And that usually means the program directors, these are deep waters here, but they'll ask you to write a rebuttal to the review. And that means they're really thinking about it.
Right.
Typically.
So this was more like we sent a very polite email to ask, or just discuss what we should do for revision. And then he directly called me right away and was just like, I suggest you not resubmit and just wait. And that's all he said. And then
I take that advice.
Yeah, so it was just like a very vague thing, and then I was left hanging up wondering, like, do I just resubmit anyways, just in case, or do I just wait it out and miss that next?
No, that's a clear signal to me. Yeah,
They're
yeah.
not clear.
Yeah, and it is kind of, some people have said the new system, and I'm not sure when this changed because things go bump in the middle of the night with some of these big guidance documents and all the people that contribute to them, but there was a time you could just call up a program director and they would just tell you, and now it's gone to this kind of, really unpleasant waiting game, and people having employees who have to be let go if this or if that, and you're just going to have to make your best judgment. But there's a lot of people you can talk to these days that have gotten requests for just-in-time materials that are not funded. But again, so the program director requests a response to the review means you're very close, and they're asking you because they have to go in front of the funding council and they have to say, I had somebody fund a 5 years ago. They reached, as we used to call reach. You go in front of the funding council and say, I want this 5 funded because of exceptionally high program relevance. That happens very rarely these days. But even if it could be a 2. Someone could come in with an outsized budget and get a 2 or a 1.5, which they're almost compelled to fund, and then they have to, if they don't want to fund it because someone didn't get their permission for this outsized budget or something else, they have to explain to the funding council, this thing scored a 1.5, but I want to pass it over for these reasons. And they don't like to do that. You only have so many bullets, silver bullets with the funding council of how much you want to reach for an application, no matter how much you may want it and see the relevance of it over and above what reviewers may have said in its score. But it does happen, and it's a mysterious thing.
Well, as far as timing, like I say, it's been quite a while since I've been through this process. When they give you a score, do you have enough time? Let's say you get a 5. Do you have enough time to hit the next funding schedule for a resubmission?
Great question. And the answer is maybe. The answer depends on how fast a CSR can pull all those reviews together, how many other 4s, how many other proposals come before yours, because they send out the best scores first. They start with the best scores. They process those summary statements. And I've heard people ask, how tough could it be for them to compile that stuff and get it out within 3 or 4 weeks rather than 2 weeks before the next deadline, which is, if you get a 5 or above, you're right on the edge. Your question is well put, and there's, if you ask me about a 4, I would say you probably get it a month before the next deadline, but I'm just giving you my kind of off the top of my head best estimate.
Right. Just trying to, make the judgment call on a proposal that I know has a few holes in it. Should I wait, or should I go ahead and submit it? And maybe it'll go through, maybe it won't, and then I resubmit. And I know that you only get one other bite of the apple. You get 2 bites of the apple, and you're out.
No, it's now you can keep resubmitting indefinitely.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's good information.
Yeah.
But
You might sleep easier or not so easy Saturday night. I don't know. I mean, you may be worried about all this now that it opens up a.
No, I understand. But as far as timing is concerned, for a small business, time is money.
Yep.
And it can make all the difference in the world. And I just was kind of curious, if you submit or not. If it's kind of has a few holes in it.
Do your best.
Understood.
Any other questions? Yeah.
How likely are you to get different reviewers if you're resubmitting multiple times?
If they're all there in the next round, very likely. In fact, that would be a certainty. But the problem with SBIR committees is they don't have like standing committees in the way that they have for academic proposals. Most of those people make a multi-year commitment when they sign up to be a reviewer, whereas no such thing exists in the SBIR world. So you may see 20% change in each cycle, or more. And I've seen more than that. I really wonder what's going on, but people are busy. They don't have time, including myself. I mean, I don't have time. right now I'm engaged in this huge project, and I just don't have time to do reviews for a while. And yes, I do miss my colleagues on the panel and their wisecracks and other comments and things like that. Any questions?
How much is there gaming of different institutes? Say some are more competitive than others, and or is it just finding the best fit?
You got to find the best fit, but the amount of money they have is also, you got to go and look at the funding levels. You know, mental health, neurology, heart, lung, and blood cancer, which is, pretty exclusive territory. That's really pushing more into, academic kind of grant mechanisms. But those, like the nursing, there's nursing, and there's another one. There's an agency that a division I've never heard of until I was rereading the latest omnibus solicitation that has a high priority item that fits something we're doing, like 90%, could do 90%. The question then came to mind, do these guys have the money to pay for a project like this? And they may not. They may have an incredibly small budget and give out two $50,000 a year. I'm just saying, exaggerating here, but I mean, I've seen things like that happen before. Any questions?
So you would say that it's really more important that you really look at the different departments in I&H to really find a match for what you're doing in terms of funding?
Yeah, in terms of funding and in terms of avoiding criticism on the part of reviewers of the importance or significance of what this is. Saying, well, NIMH says it's very significant, and quote that over and over. NIMH says it's important instead of I'm saying it's important. So if you can find this in somewhere, and so there's a huge document, and it's no fun to plow through that. At least I've never found it to be fun. It's not as it's not a casual read, but spend the time on it and see if you can find it. It's a PDF, so you can search it. Right?
So this kind of goes to your point about instead of trying to meet the deadline, take the time to align everything up.
Yeah.
I know we've been primarily talking about biotech, biology, and NIH. Does your recommendations translate outside of NIH to NSF, DoD, some of the other agencies?
In general, yes. I mean, a lot of these, the program structure is the same. The kinds of ways you rationalize, justify things are the same. The topic area is very different. So impact, if you're developing a missile system, I guess impact is easy to define, right? Something like that. But impact in the healthcare system of something for babies with cerebral palsy is very, very difficult to define. So yeah, there's those kinds of almost existential elements of determining what significance and impact are. Not sure how to put it any better. Yeah.
We've been talking to clinicians, as part of the commercialization side, and a big part of what they've come back to us with is, we don't care as physicians about the money thing.
But
yeah, what we care about is quality of life, and we do believe that it will have, so they're like, that's our number one. That's really hard to commercialize. And then the other part of it is, and we think that this is something that will have outcomes, measurable outcomes, that will lower costs. We know that if we have access to this, that it will lower costs. But if we played with numbers, and we can play with any numbers that we want. When you said do the deep dive, we've done the deep dive. We've pulled up all the data that we can. But it's still sort of a tam, sam, som. Yeah. Yeah, it's the kaleidoscope. So when you're writing the commercialization side of that, when the reviewers are looking at that, I don't know. From a commercialization side, does that just mean money? How many dollars I'm going to save? Because quality of life is.
Today, commercialization sections average about 8 pages, and they're really well written. If this project gets a fundable score, I can say, referred to in a slide earlier, you're competing against very experienced, multiple award winners, 90% of the time. And in a commercialization section, my opinion, my experience, my opinion is that most reviewers do not spend a lot of time reading commercialization sections because they're tedious. It's a great amount of work. The same reason I mentioned in the context of a fast track. To read a fast track, a combined phase 1, phase 2, and commercialization section and intelligently critique it is 25 hours minimum. There's no way you're going to read that much stuff and deeply understand it to the point you can intelligently critique it and write the critique and edit your comments to the point that everything lines up. It's just not possible. So that the burden on reviewers with commercialization sections is similar in that it takes a great deal of time, and you're talking about things that are outside of their level of expertise. Commercialization sections are rarely attacked. It's been a while. That used to be when they had was it the page limit or something else that they were easier to attack and find fault with, is probably a better phrase, than today. But people do a very good job on these. And again, it's unfortunate everybody can't see examples of these winning proposals, of what works and what lengths these guys go to make these things highly appealing, to the point of reviewers just throwing their hands up and reading part of it, because who's going to spend a lot of time to read those 8 pages or even vet some of the statements or claims? I have done that more than a couple of times when I think that the claims for something that addresses a tiny, tiny market are just not justifiable. Yes, I do spend Saturday nights, and I will pull up those references, and I will look at whether those claims are justified or not based on what the applicant cited. But in general, no. In general, they're going to accept your value proposition in terms of market research, market projections. They're most of the time. It's rare that it's not.
It's kind of a technical question on the references. Is it acceptable to reference, basically give a URL to a website? Because on some market information, that's the only place, there will not be anything directly published.
They specifically forbid that. I don't know. People started putting these inside of grants as a way to get around the page limitation. And for all this information, see this URL that we happen to be sponsoring somewhere. And
I mean the reference section, you can't even put it there.
No. They ask you not to.
Could you talk a little bit more about really how much space and detail and numbers should go into the commercialization for phase 1 proposal?
Well, there is no commercialization section in a phase 1, but I mentioned earlier too that you are fully expected to comment on the commercial, I forget the phrase, commercial potential, thank you. They used to be called commercialization pathway, but these terms come in and out of vogue, and I can't keep up with them. But yes, the commercial potential, commercialization pathway, in a way that's not. There's no space for it. There's no room for it. Nobody asks for it in the solicitation instructions. But you nonetheless, reviewers, if you don't include that, you'll be called out, and I bet a lot that you'll have a problem.
Do you need specific numbers, like? You've done the research on exactly the amount of money this is going to save, and you put those numbers.
If I had that, I would.
Okay.
Yes.
What if that's not
Yep.
easy to do? Are they just going to not take anything you say seriously if you say it's more affordable?
If it's non-intuitive, if someone is likely to question it and you don't have any references to justify it, someone like myself would probably look into it more deeply. If it's an outsized assertion, just get that kind of intuitive feel. Otherwise, it's to get people have incredible difficulty most of the time getting really good market data because they're doing something new. By definition, they're doing something that's outside of the current, prevailing kind of market. Or if it's an incremental innovation, maybe there's a whole bunch of data. If you have a new heart monitor device that's identical to what GE markets, but it costs 75% less and saves time in other ways, then you can go right to these existing market data for something that's kind of in the mainstream. But otherwise, these behavioral and other kinds of programs that people are proposing have a terrible time trying to justify the market potential of them. And they're usually That's a problem. And reviewers recognize this from the get-go. Nonetheless, I've seen sympathy votes. Let's say I know someone who's seen sympathy votes on proposals that don't make a lot of sense to me. And as a reviewer, I have a problem with that. So I could, you'll be able to edit the video at this point. I'll pause. I was just in closing here, I was one of the people in the neurology committee. I have to share one more story with you. It was pretty funny because the first day was really tough. It was these guys are very motivated applicants, and the people in the room are very tense. You could cut the tension with a knife in that room. It was really high-powered proposals and a lot of high-powered reviewers. And I had jumped on a couple of these proposals and really taken apart some. You can turn the recorder off, but I really jumped on some of these applicants and the applications rather, and it was there was some sparks flying over some of these comments and things, and then I was assigned as a second reviewer on an application for some neurological device. The first reviewer was a guy I knew well. It was a very shy, understated guy. He was sitting straight across the room from me in this big conference room. He was sitting straight across, and they said, "Okay, reviewer one, please begin with your comments." And he had his papers out, and he said, "Well, I thought there was some merit to this project, and I think there was some value to the device." And he kept looking at me, and everybody in the room this guy kept looking at me like he was waiting for me to pounce or something, and it was really embarrassing. Everybody in the room stopped, and they looked over at me, and I said, "What? I didn't say anything yet." So there's a lot of interesting moments in this dynamics of the review process, but typically the proposals most of you will be submitting, I would take a guess, or be reviewed by the Lifespan Neurobehavioral Science Committee. I would take a wild guess with many exceptions, but depending. If you get into that neurology committee or radiology committee, those are a rough ride.
Does the cancer committee have any specific reputation?
Which?
The oncology cancer NCI?
Yes.
Are they
Yes.
favorable
Yes.
or-
Yes. That's a tough group. That's a tough group. And those guys that try to steer their proposals, find some way, there's some behavioral angle to something, and steer it into the soft committee of putty cats over there and get around that getting chewed up by guys that are really hardcore. I'm speaking in the vernacular now. I'm speaking as if we were close friends and no one else was listening.
Dr. Jim O'Halloran, everybody.
Yeah. Thank you.